I remember everything about that night. Every little detail is burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. I wish I had never gone to that cabin. I wish I had never agreed to spend that weekend alone in the woods. But at the time, it seemed like a perfect idea. A break from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head, a weekend of quiet isolation. The drive up was long. The roads twisted through thick trees that seemed endless. My cell service faded about an hour before I reached the cabin. I wasn't worried. I had expected that. I had a map, a full tank of gas, and a cabin stocked with supplies. I had planned for everything, or at least I thought I had. The cabin was old but well kept. The wooden planks creaked under my boots as I stepped onto the porch. A key had been left for me under a loose rock by the door, just as the owner had told me in his email. I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of dust and wood. The place was small, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. The furniture was old-fashioned but sturdy. A few framed photos hung on the walls, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. I didn't think much of them, just old decorations left behind by previous owners. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my bags, stacked the firewood neatly by the fireplace, and made myself a quick meal. As the sun started to set, the cabin grew colder. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the dry wood catching quickly. The glow of the flames made the cabin feel almost cozy. Then I heard the first noise. Came from outside, a rustling sound, like something moving through the trees. I paused, listening. The woods were full of animals. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. It was nothing unusual, but something about the sound made me uneasy. It wasn't the occasional snap of a twig or the distant call of an owl. It was steady, deliberate. I walked to the window and looked out. The trees stood still. The dirt path leading to the cabin was empty. I saw nothing, but the unease remained. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat back down by the fire. The sound didn't stop. It moved. It circled the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt it. That nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. That heavy awareness of being watched. I tried to shake it off. I turned on the small radio I had brought with me, letting the low hum of static and distant voices fill the silence. I sat in the armchair, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the fire, trying to push away the paranoia. Then I heard the second noise, a soft scraping. This time it was against the cabin itself, against the wooden walls. Slow, almost thoughtful. My breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded against my ribs. I turned off the radio and listened. The scraping sound moved, traveling along the wall, inching toward the window. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and flicked it on. My hands were shaking as I aimed the beam at the window, expecting to see nothing. The glass reflected the firelight behind me. The trees stood still. No movement, no sign of anything. Then the sound stopped. Silence stretched out, heavy, suffocating. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, frozen in place, waiting, but nothing else happened. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a tree branch brushing against the wood, maybe an animal scratching at the surface. My nerves were just getting the better of me. I double-checked the locks and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. I lay in the dark, every little creak of the cabin making my skin crawl, but eventually exhaustion won. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something wasn't right. I could feel it before I even opened my eyes. That same heavy feeling from earlier. That feeling of being watched. My body was rigid, every muscle locked in place. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin. Then I heard it again. The scraping. This time it was at the bedroom window. I stopped breathing. I didn't move. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something along the glass. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. My fingers wrapped around it, but I didn't turn it on. I just lay there listening. The scraping stopped, and then a soft click. The door handle, Someone was trying to get inside. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. I sat up slowly, moving as quietly as I could. The bedroom door was closed, but I could hear the handle moving. Testing. The locks held. Then silence. I stayed frozen, my ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, waiting. Then the footsteps started. Not inside, outside, moving away from the cabin. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed up, listening to every sound, every whisper of movement outside. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the trees, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my things, packed up, and got the hell out of there. When I reached the nearest town, I found a gas station with Wi-Fi and checked my emails, planning to let the cabin owner know I was leaving early. That's when I saw it. An unread message from the owner. Subject * urgent. Do not stay at cabin. I felt sick as I opened it. The message was short, rushed. I'm so sorry. There's been a mistake. The last guest reported someone tampering with the locks. I meant to change them before you arrived, but I didn't get the chance. Please leave as soon as you can and let me know you're safe. I stared at the screen, my hands cold and numb. Someone had been there. Someone had been trying to get in, and I had spent the entire night trapped inside that cabin with them just outside. I never responded to the email. I never spoke to the owner again, and I sure as hell never went back to that cabin. But I still think about it sometimes. About the scraping at the walls, the slow testing turn of the door handle, and the fact that even after I left, I never actually saw who or what was out there. I remember everything about that night. The air was cold, dry, and still, like the woods were holding their breath. I was alone in the cabin, tucked deep in the mountains, miles away from anyone. That was the whole point. I needed time to clear my head, to reset. Work had drained me, and I thought a week away from the noise of the city would do me good. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with an old wood-burning stove. It smelled of pine and dust, like it had been sitting empty for a long time. The owner told me no one had rented it in over a year, but it had everything I needed: firewood, running water, a propane stove. I had stocked up on food before driving up, knowing there were no stores for miles. The first few nights were peaceful. I hiked during the day, took in the silence, let my mind settle. At night, I sat by the fire, drank whiskey, read. The isolation was exactly what I needed. But then things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. I'd wake up and feel like something was different, though I couldn't put my finger on it. A chair slightly out of place, my boots not where I'd left them. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I moved them and forgot. Then, one morning, I found the front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked before bed. My stomach tightened, but I told myself maybe the old lock was loose. Maybe I hadn't turned it all the way. I tried not to think about it. That night, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. The room was silent, but I had that feeling, like someone was watching me. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside. I told myself it was paranoia, that being alone in the woods was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Footprints, not mine, leading from the trees to my cabin, stopping just outside the front door. They were deep, fresh. Someone had been here, standing right outside while I slept. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked everything. I thought about leaving, but I had driven 5 hours to get here. I had another 3 days left, and I didn't want to let paranoia ruin my trip. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. Maybe it was nothing. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, listened for every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard something, movement outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Then the soft creak of the front porch. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Minutes passed. Then, a long, slow scrape against the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just gripped the poker tighter, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading into the woods. Morning came, and I stepped outside, my hands shaking. The footprints were there again, circling the cabin. My chest tightened. I wasn't imagining this. Someone was out here. Someone was watching me. I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. I wasn't spending another night in that cabin. I threw my bag in the truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic crawled up my spine. The truck had been fine the day before. I popped the hood, checked the battery. The cables were loose, almost completely unscrewed. Someone had done this. I tightened them with shaking hands, jumped into the truck, and turned the key again. The engine roared to life. Relief flooded me. I backed out, glancing at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure half hidden behind the trees, just standing there, watching. I didn't wait. I slammed the gas and tore down the dirt road, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I never went back, never told anyone the full story. The owner called me a week later, said I had left the cabin in a hurry, said the place was just as I had left it, except for the footprints. They were still there, new ones, leading up to the door. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A full week alone in a remote cabin, far from everything. No phone service, no internet, just me and the wilderness. Sounded perfect. The drive up was long and rough. The last 30 miles were on an old dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Potholes, loose gravel, and tree roots pushing through the surface made the drive slow and nerve-wracking. My truck wasn't exactly new, and I worried about the tires, but I made it. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked solid. The wood was aged, the porch had a few missing planks, and the windows were old, but it felt sturdy. Inside, there was a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area, a fireplace, and a bathroom that smelled like mildew. There was no electricity, just a propane stove and some old oil lamps. I unloaded my gear, set up a small stack of firewood by the fireplace, and put away my food. The nearest town was nearly 50 miles away, so I had to be careful with my supplies. I had enough food to last me, plus a rifle in case I needed to hunt. That first night, I sat outside on the porch and listened to the forest. The sound of insects filled the air, along with the occasional rustling in the trees. It was peaceful. No car horns, no voices, just nature. But as the night went on, I started to feel something else. Not fear, not at first, but a kind of awareness. Like I was being watched. It was stupid, I told myself. Just my mind adjusting to the quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I went inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. I hadn't seen a single soul on my way up here, but I still had this strange feeling in my gut. I kept my rifle next to the bed that night. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound, a soft creaking. It was coming from outside, near the porch. I lay still, listening. Could have been anything, a raccoon, maybe a deer. I told myself that, but my hands still tightened around the rifle. The sound stopped after a while, and I forced myself to go back to sleep. In the morning, I checked the porch but saw nothing unusual. Just old wood, dirt, and fallen leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. The next day was quiet. I spent most of it exploring the woods nearby, checking out the lake about a mile away, and gathering some firewood. I made sure to stay within a reasonable distance of the cabin. The last thing I needed was to get lost. That night, the feeling returned. That uneasy, crawling sensation on the back of my neck. I sat by the fire, staring at the window. The oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They came from just outside the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the rifle. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they started again, circling the cabin. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but animals don't move like that. I waited, barely breathing, until the sound faded away. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. That day, I decided to make sure I was prepared. I gathered more firewood, sharpened my knife, and loaded my rifle. I even made tripwires using some old cans and fishing line I had in my gear. If someone came back, I'd hear them. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, listening. At some point, I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. Slow, careful. They stopped just outside the cabin. Then something scraped against the wood. I raised my rifle, aiming at the door. My heart pounded in my chest. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I barely slept. When morning came, I stepped outside, rifle in hand. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. Leading from the tree-line to my cabin. But they didn't lead away. Whoever had been watching me hadn't left. They were still out there. The rest of the day, I debated my options. I could stay, but I'd be trapped if things got worse. Or I could leave, but that meant driving 30 miles down a dangerous road with the possibility of someone waiting for me. I decided to leave. I packed my gear fast, keeping my rifle close. The whole time, I felt eyes on me. As I loaded my truck, I saw something in the trees, a figure half hidden behind a thick trunk. I didn't wait. I got in, started the truck, and tore out of there. The road was worse going down, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was nearly back to the highway that I realized my hands were shaking. I never went back for my deposit. Never tried to find out who or what had been out there. I just left, and I never went back to the woods alone again. I had no reason to be out there alone. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle, but he barely used it anymore. Said he was getting too old for roughing it out in the woods, so he handed me the keys and told me to go whenever I wanted. I had taken a few trips before, but never alone. This time, I wanted the solitude. No phone buzzing, no emails, no people. Just silence. The drive was long, mostly winding roads cutting through thick forest. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town. No neighbors, no cell service, no distractions. That was the appeal. The further I got from civilization, the more at ease I felt. The first few days were peaceful. I woke up to the sound of birds and the rustling of trees. Spent my time chopping wood, fishing, reading. At night, I'd sit by the fire, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was exactly what I had needed. Then, on the fourth night, I noticed something off. It wasn't a big thing, just little details that seemed wrong. The firewood pile looked smaller than I remembered, like someone had taken a few logs. The fishing gear I had left by the door was slightly out of place. I figured I was just imagining it. Maybe I had used more wood than I thought. Maybe I had bumped the gear without realizing it. By the fifth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Footprints in the dirt outside, ones that weren't mine. I checked the doors, the windows, all locked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. That night, I stayed up late. I turned off all the lights and sat by the window watching, listening. The forest was quiet, but not the way it had been before. It felt like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam toward the tree-line. Nothing, just darkness and the endless rows of trees. I stayed out there for a long time, scanning the woods. Eventually, I went back inside and locked the door. Sleep didn't come easy. Every sound put me on edge. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind outside, the occasional rustling in the trees. I told myself it was just animals, but deep down I knew better. The next morning I decided to leave. I packed up my things and loaded them into the truck. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. No rumble of the engine, not even a click. I popped the hood and checked the battery. The cables were gone. Not loose, not damaged, just gone. Panic set in. Someone had been here. Someone had done this. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing. No phone, no way to leave. I grabbed the rifle my uncle had left behind, checked that it was loaded. I wasn't going to sit there and wait. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window again, rifle in my lap, staring into the dark. Then movement, a figure, just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person standing there, watching. My hands tightened around the gun. For hours, the figure didn't move, just stood there, silent, like it was waiting for something. Then, just before dawn, it turned and walked back into the trees. The moment the sun came up, I grabbed my pack and set out on foot. The nearest town was 15 miles away. I didn't care how long it took. I wasn't staying another night. I walked fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I reached the road sometime in the afternoon. A passing truck picked me up and took me to town. When I told the sheriff what had happened, he barely reacted. Said people went missing out there sometimes. Said I was lucky. I never went back to the cabin. My uncle sold it not long after. But sometimes, I still dream about that night, about the figure standing in the woods, waiting, and I always wake up before it moves again. I wasn't planning on staying at the cabin alone. That was never the plan. My friend, Mark, was supposed to be with me for the weekend, but at the last minute, he bailed. Something about his girlfriend needing him, some argument, whatever. I told him it was fine, that I'd go alone. I wanted the peace and quiet. Anyway, the cabin belonged to my uncle. It sat deep in the woods, miles away from anything. No neighbors, no traffic, no cell reception. Just trees, a dirt road, and a small lake about a mile downhill. I'd been there before, but never alone. This was my first time staying overnight without company, and I told myself it didn't matter. I got there late in the afternoon, parked my truck near the porch, and brought my bags inside. The cabin was old but sturdy. The walls were thick logs, the floor creaked a little, and the whole place smelled like pine and dust. A fireplace sat against the far wall, next to a set of windows that looked out into the woods. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a tiny bathroom, and one bedroom with a lumpy mattress. It was simple, but I liked it. I spent the first hour settling in. I lit the wood stove because the air was colder than I expected, checked the water pump behind the cabin to make sure it was still working, and gathered some firewood from the pile out back. I even walked down to the lake just to get a feel for the place before dark. The water was still black as ink. The whole area was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just my own footsteps crunching on dead leaves. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the door, threw my boots off, and made a simple dinner: canned soup and a sandwich. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I was just looking forward to a quiet night, maybe some reading before bed. But then I heard it, a single, sharp knock at the door. I froze. My spoon was halfway to my mouth. My body tensed. My first thought was Mark. Maybe he changed his mind and drove out here after all. But when I got up and looked through the small window by the door, no one was there. I waited, listened. Nothing but the wind picking up through the trees. I told myself I imagined it, that maybe something had fallen outside and hit the porch. But I wasn't convinced. I grabbed the flashlight and cracked the door open, shining the beam across the porch. Empty. The truck was where I left it. The trees were motionless in the distance. There were no footprints in the dirt, no signs of movement, just silence. I locked the door again, shaking off the nerves. It had to be my imagination. Long day, the isolation playing tricks on me. I tried to go back to my dinner, but my appetite was gone. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep well. The woods outside felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you strain your ears. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something. A rustling, a creak, a faint tapping. Each time I sat up and listened, there was nothing. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal, just the battery percentage slowly dropping. At some point, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. 3 knocks. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. They were slow, deliberate, and too loud to be the wind. My heart pounded. I turned over in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. My brain raced through explanations, but none of them made sense. I sat up, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. I glanced at the window, pitch black outside. I waited. A full minute passed, then two. My mouth was dry, my hands clammy. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a branch hitting the cabin, but deep down I knew better. I didn't move. I just sat there, barely breathing. Then something moved outside. Not a knock this time. Something brushing against the wall, a soft scrape of wood against wood. It moved slowly along the length of the cabin. I followed the sound with my ears, picturing it. Something dragging its hand, or its fingers, along the outside wall. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on. The weak beam barely lit the room, but it made me feel less exposed. The sound stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the window. Morning. I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My head was heavy, my limbs sore, but the moment I sat up, it all came back. I threw on my boots and stepped outside. The air was cold, the ground damp. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning for anything out of place. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Dozens of them circling the cabin. Some fresh, some older, half washed away by the rain. They led to the porch, to the door, to my bedroom window. I felt sick. My stomach twisted. My skin broke out in goosebumps. I wasn't alone out here. I locked the door the second I got back inside. My hands shook as I grabbed my keys and my bag. I didn't care what I left behind, I just needed to go. I threw everything into my truck and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then died. No. I tried again. Nothing. Just the clicking sound of a dead engine. That's when I noticed it. The hood was unlatched. I stepped out slowly, my whole body screaming at me to run. I popped the hood, and my stomach dropped. Wires. Cut. Someone had been here last night. Someone had walked around my cabin, knocked on my door, and made sure I wasn't leaving. I backed away from the truck, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I had no phone signal, no working car, no way to call for help. I turned and ran. I didn't think, I just ran. I took the road, the long winding dirt path that led back to town. I didn't care how far it was. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were ripping apart. Somewhere behind me, deep in the trees, I swear I heard footsteps. I never went back to the cabin. My uncle asked me why, and I never gave him the full story. I just told him it didn't feel right out there alone. But the truth is, I know someone was out there, watching, waiting, and if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I would have made it out at all. I never liked the idea of staying alone in a cabin, but I needed the break. After months of working in the city, surrounded by noise, stress, and the same dull routine, I wanted something different. When a coworker mentioned his uncle's cabin deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place to clear my head. The drive up was long and rough. The paved road turned into dirt, the kind that made my car shake no matter how slow I went. My phone lost signal about an hour before I even reached the cabin, which didn't surprise me. I expected it. Still, it felt strange, knowing I was completely cut off. If something went wrong, there was no one to call. The cabin itself was old, but sturdy. A small wooden place surrounded by thick trees, sitting next to a quiet lake. It had everything I needed: electricity, a fireplace, a stocked kitchen. No Wi-Fi, but that was the point. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked, made coffee, and sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. It was beautiful. The silence was strange at first. I wasn't used to it. At night, the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I told myself it was just animals. The first night was normal. I locked the doors, shut the windows, and slept without any issues. The second night, though, that was different. It started with a noise, a soft, distant sound that woke me up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was an animal moving through the woods. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. A slow, deliberate sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't locked the door properly. Maybe the wind had pushed it open, and some animal had wandered in. I grabbed the flashlight by my bed and slowly got up, trying not to make any noise. The floor creaked under my weight and I winced. I stepped into the main room, sweeping the flashlight across the space. Nothing was out of place. The door was still locked. The windows were shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to being alone in a place like this. But something about it stuck with me. That night, I made sure everything was locked, double-checking the doors and windows before I went to bed. Then it happened again. The noise, except this time it was louder, closer. It sounded like something moving just outside my bedroom door. A slow, scraping sound. I stayed still, my heart pounding. The noise stopped, then started again. I reached for the flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it at the door. Nothing. I forced myself to get up, to check the cabin again. Every door was locked. Every window was shut. I even checked the small basement, though I hated the idea of going down there. It was empty, just a dark, damp space with old tools and boxes. By the third night, I was exhausted, but I knew I wouldn't sleep easily. I kept the flashlight in my hand, listening. When the noise came again, I didn't wait. I jumped out of bed and ran straight for the main room, shining my light across every surface. And then I saw it. The rug in front of the fireplace had moved, just slightly, but enough to be noticeable. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I crouched down, gripping the edge of the rug, and lifted it. There was a door, a wooden hatch set into the floor. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in too well. My stomach tightened as I reached for the handle. I hesitated, then pulled it open. A narrow staircase led down into the darkness. I didn't want to go down. Every part of me screamed to shut the hatch and pretend I never saw it. But I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight and started down the stairs. The air was thick and damp. The basement wasn't empty like I had thought. In the farthest corner, there was an old mattress on the floor. Next to it, an empty plate and a plastic water bottle. The sight made my skin crawl. Someone had been living down here recently. Then I heard it. A sound from above. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the wooden floor. Someone was inside the cabin. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath. The footsteps moved toward the hatch. I backed into the shadows, pressing myself against the cold wall. The hatch creaked as it opened. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the light from the cabin. I couldn't see their face. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't care how much noise I made. I sprinted up the stairs, shoving past the figure. I didn't look back. I threw open the front door and ran into the trees. I don't know how long I ran. I just kept going, my breath burning in my lungs. When I finally stopped, I was deep in the woods, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. No signal. I kept moving, following the dirt road, hoping for a car, a house, anything. Hours later, I found the highway. A trucker stopped when he saw me, and I told him everything. The police went to the cabin, but whoever had been there was gone. The basement was empty. The mattress, the plate, the water bottle gone. Like no one had ever been there. But I know what I saw. I know someone was there, watching me, waiting. I never went back. I never even asked my coworker about his uncle's cabin. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go to a cabin alone again. I was halfway up the mountain when the storm rolled in. The sky had been clear when I started my drive, but in a matter of minutes, thick clouds swallowed the sun, and the wind picked up. I had no choice but to keep going. There was no turning back, not with the road as narrow as it was. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a chance to get away from the noise of the city and the stress of work. I had booked it weeks ago, imagining quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, staring out at the untouched wilderness. It was far enough from town that I wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough that if I needed anything, a short drive would get me there. Or so I thought. The road twisted and turned, climbing higher with every mile. The trees grew thick on either side, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky. My tires crunched over gravel and dirt, the occasional pothole making my truck jolt. The storm was coming fast. A few fat raindrops hit my windshield, then more. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, rain pounded the roof of my truck like fists. I killed the engine and stepped out, immediately soaked to the bone. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. A single-story structure with dark wooden walls and a pitched roof. A porch wrapped around the front, and an old rocking chair sat in the corner, unmoving despite the wind. The whole place looked forgotten, like it had been sitting there for years without anyone to take care of it. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made a run for the door. The key had been left under a loose board on the porch, just as the owner had told me. It took a moment to find it, but my hands finally closed around the cold metal. I shoved the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale. The cabin was basic, a small living area with a couch and a wood stove, a kitchenette with an old fridge and a gas stove, and a single bedroom down a short hallway. A door at the back led to a bathroom. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, like no one had been there in months. I dropped my bag on the couch and went to the kitchen. The power was supposed to be working, but when I flipped the switch, nothing happened. Great, I'd have to rely on the gas lamps mounted on the walls. I found a box of matches in a drawer and lit one of them. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I tried my phone. No signal, no surprise there. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I checked the wood stove, relieved to find a stack of dry firewood beside it. I started a fire, watching as the flames caught and spread. At least I wouldn't freeze. I spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. The rain didn't let up, and I had no choice but to stay inside. There was an old radio on the kitchen counter, and when I turned it on, static filled the cabin. I twisted the dial, searching for anything, but there was nothing, just empty noise. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my chest. It was just the isolation, I told myself, just the storm. But then I heard something, a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on gravel. I froze. The fire crackled behind me, casting flickering light across the room. I strained to listen, but the storm was too loud. Then, another sound, closer, a soft, shuffling noise, like something moving just beyond the porch. I moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The rain streaked the glass, blurring my vision, but I swore I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. A man. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. He was tall, his clothes dark and heavy. His face was obscured by the rain, but he was standing still, watching. I stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. My truck was outside, but I'd have to go past him to reach it. I waited. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. I turned away from the window and grabbed the knife from the kitchen counter. If he tried to get inside, I'd be ready. Then, another noise, this time, from the back of the cabin. A thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open. My stomach dropped. The back door. I hadn't locked it. I moved as quietly as I could, gripping the knife tight. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent. Then I saw it. The back door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. My heart pounded. I forced myself forward, reaching for the door. I grabbed it and slammed it shut, throwing the bolt into place. The moment I turned around, I felt it. I wasn't alone. The air had shifted. The silence was heavier. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I spun, knife raised. Nothing. The cabin was empty, but I knew someone had been inside. I checked every corner, every closet, under the bed. Nothing, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. I sat awake the entire night, knife in hand, staring at the door. The The storm raged on outside. Morning came, gray and cold. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag and ran to my truck. The figure was gone. The forest was still, but I wasn't staying. As I drove down the mountain, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, dark and silent. But as I turned the corner, I saw it, just for a second. A figure standing on the porch, watching me leave. I didn't want to spend the night in that cabin. I had planned to make the trip upstate, spend a few hours hiking, then drive back home before it got too dark. But things don't always go as planned. The first mistake was underestimating how rough the trails would be. I thought I could handle a few miles, maybe even push for more if I felt good. But by the time I realized I was in over my head, it was too late to turn back. The second mistake was assuming my phone would have service out here. I had a fully charged battery, but no signal. The third mistake, the biggest one, was thinking the cabin I found was a stroke of luck. It was old, not completely abandoned, but clearly not well maintained. The door was unlocked, and inside was dusty but not destroyed. A few pieces of old furniture, a fireplace with a stack of dry wood, and even a working oil lamp. I figured it was some kind of emergency shelter or hunting cabin. Either way, it was better than spending the night outside. My legs were killing me, and the temperature had started to drop. I told myself I'd sleep for a few hours and leave at first light. I should have kept walking. The first thing that felt off was the silence. Not just the usual quiet of the woods, but something deeper. No wind, no rustling in the trees, no distant sounds of animals. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I was just overanalyzing. I ate one of the protein bars I had packed, drank some water, then started a fire in the fireplace. It crackled and popped, giving the room a dull orange glow. I felt a little better with the warmth. Then I noticed the door. Not the one I came in through, the other one, at the back of the cabin, barely visible in the dim light. It was smaller than a normal door, and something about it made my skin crawl. The hinges were rusted, but the wood looked clean. Not new, but as if someone had been taking care of it. There were no handles, just an old-fashioned keyhole, but no key in sight. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just an old storage space, maybe locked from the other side. Maybe it didn't even open anymore. I didn't need to go near it. I just needed to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay there on the dusty floor, staring at that door, waiting for something to happen. I listened, not for anything in particular, just listened. Then I heard it. Not loud, not obvious, just a soft scrape, like something shifting, like weight against wood, like something adjusting itself. I sat up, my heart pounding. The fire cast flickering shadows against the walls. I told myself I was hearing things, maybe an old beam settling, maybe a mouse behind the walls. But I didn't believe that. My instincts were screaming at me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the door. The beam wobbled in my shaking hand. The keyhole stared back at me, a small, black void. I thought about looking through it. Some stupid part of my brain wanted to know what was on the other side. But I knew better than that. I knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Another scrape, closer this time. A slow, deliberate shift. I grabbed my bag, my jacket, my flashlight, anything I could carry, and backed away toward the front door. I didn't care how dark it was outside. I wasn't staying here. I reached for the doorknob. Locked. I twisted harder, pulled, shoved. It wouldn't budge. The sound came again, louder now, right behind the door. A deep, deliberate inhale, like something smelling the air. I ran to the window, nailed shut. I turned back to the door. The fire flickered. The room felt smaller. Then, the doorknob rattled. The back door. The one without a handle. The one with only a keyhole. Something was trying to open it. I stopped breathing. I didn't move. I just listened. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then a tap. Light. Almost polite. Just once. Then another. Then another. A steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. My body locked up. I stood there, gripping my flashlight so hard my fingers ached. The tapping stopped. The fire crackled. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I felt something shift in the air, the weight of something pressing against the other side of that door. Then, a click. The keyhole turned. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. I threw myself against the front door, slammed my shoulder into it, kicked it, shoved it. Something gave, and I stumbled forward, out into the freezing night. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I ran through the dark, crashing through the trees, tripping over roots, cutting my hands on branches. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed onto the cold dirt, gasping for air, my heart threatening to explode in my chest. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone. No glow from the fire, no sign of the structure, just trees and darkness. I don't know how far I ran. I don't know if the cabin was ever really there. But I know one thing, I wasn't alone in that place. And whatever was behind that door, it was coming for me. I don't know why I thought going to the cabin alone was a good idea. Maybe I just needed to get away from the city, from the noise, from people. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could handle solitude. Either way, I regretted it by the second night. The cabin belonged to my uncle, a man I barely knew. He had bought it decades ago, used it for hunting trips, and then left it to rot. When he passed, no one in the family wanted it. My mother offered it to me, knowing I liked my space. I didn't even hesitate. The drive there was long, a winding road through miles of thick forest. No gas stations, no stores, no signs of life. Just trees pressing in on both sides. My phone lost signal about an hour before I arrived. It wasn't a surprise. I had expected that much. The cabin itself was what I expected, too. Small, old, forgotten. The wood was gray and splintered, the porch sagging. A single padlock held the front door shut, but the key turned easily. Inside, dust coated every surface. The air was stale. A single bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. Simple, quiet, isolated. I settled in quickly, unpacked my food, checked the cabinets, found nothing but rusted cans and rodent droppings. The fridge didn't work, of course. No power, no running water. The well out back was supposed to be functional, but I had brought bottled water just in case. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. The kind of silence you don't get in the city. It was nice. I went to bed early, feeling good about my decision. The second night changed everything. I spent most of the day exploring. There wasn't much to see. Just trees, an old shed filled with rusted tools, and the well. The crank creaked when I tried it, but the bucket still brought up water. I didn't trust it enough to drink, though. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin, reading. That's when I heard the first sound. A branch snapping, close, too close. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I convinced myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. I went back to reading. Then another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. I held my breath, waiting for something more. But there was nothing. No knock, no voice, no movement after that. Still, my gut told me something wasn't right. I locked the door. The night came fast. The woods got darker than I expected. I lit the old oil lamp on the table and tried to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. A thud against the wall made me jump. Then another. Slow, rhythmic. I grabbed the only weapon I had, an old hunting knife my uncle had left behind. I stood by the door, barely breathing. The noise stopped. I waited, but nothing happened. Minutes stretched into an hour. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind. The cabin was old, the wood warped and loose. Could have been anything. I forced myself to lie down, knife still in my hand. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise had me wide awake. At some point, exhaustion won. But then I woke up to something worse. The door was open, not just unlocked. Open. I sat up so fast my head spun. My eyes darted around the room. The lamp was still burning. My bag was where I left it. Nothing seemed missing. But the door, I knew I had locked it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the knife. I stood up, every muscle tense, listening. There was nothing but silence, that deep, suffocating silence. I stepped to the door, peering out. The trees stood motionless in the moonlight. The dirt path leading to my car was empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I closed the door, locked it again, and shoved a chair under the handle. Then I sat on the floor, back against the wall, knife in hand, waiting. The night stretched on. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had convinced myself that maybe the wind had blown it open. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I decided to stay one more night. A mistake. The day passed uneventfully, but the feeling never left. That creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door, wedged the chair against it, and sat with my back to the wall again, knife on my lap. I must have dozed off, because when I woke up, the chair was moved. The door was unlocked, and this time there were footprints, bare feet, dozens of them pressed into the dust-covered floor. They led from the door, across the room, around where I had been sleeping, then back out the door. I didn't grab anything. I didn't look back. I got into my car and drove, speeding down that dark, empty road, not stopping until I was hours away. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. The road to the cabin was long and uneven. Loose gravel crunched under my tires as I drove deeper into the woods. The trees stretched high, their branches tangled together, blocking most of the sky. My phone had lost service about 15 minutes ago, and I hadn't seen another car since turning off the highway. The cabin was miles away from anything, just the way I wanted it. I needed the isolation. After everything that happened back home, I just wanted silence. No emails, no texts, no people. Just me and the forest. I had rented the cabin for a week. It wasn't some fancy lodge, just a small, one-bedroom wooden structure with the basics. I didn't need much. When I finally pulled up to the place, the sun was starting to set. The air was crisp, clean. There was a small porch with a wooden rocking chair, a firewood pile stacked neatly against the wall. The cabin itself looked old, but sturdy. A single light bulb hung above the door, buzzing faintly. Inside, it was exactly as the pictures showed. A tiny living space with a couch, a wood-burning stove, and a kitchenette. The bedroom had a small bed, just big enough for one person, and a nightstand with an old-fashioned lamp. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio sitting on the shelf. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The only sound was the occasional rustling of the trees outside. I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the darkness settle in. Felt peaceful, but on the second night, something changed. I woke up to a noise, a soft, steady sound, like tapping. I turned over in bed, half asleep, and listened. It was coming from outside, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. I sat up, my heart already beating faster. I checked my phone. No service. The noise stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but I didn't hear it again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a branch shifting in the wind. But when I finally lay back down, I struggled to fall asleep. The next morning, I found something strange. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the tree line, the grass was disturbed. It looked like someone had been standing there for a long time. The ground was pressed down, the way it gets when someone shuffles their feet in one place. I tried to shake it off. Could have been anything. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But that night, the tapping came back. This time, it was closer. I stayed in bed, listening. It was a slow, rhythmic knock, like someone was testing the walls. Then it moved, from the side of the cabin to the porch. I sat up, gripping the sheets. It stopped. Then the door handle rattled. Every muscle in my body locked up. I stared at the door, barely breathing. The handle jerked again, harder this time. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like forever, it stopped. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, ears straining for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be the wind. Maybe the cold was making the wood shift. I didn't let myself think about anything else. But the next morning, I found footprints. Bare footprints, pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the trees to my porch. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My stomach twisted. They were human. No shoes, just bare feet. The prints slightly uneven, like whoever left them was limping. I thought about leaving. I should have. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe some hiker had wandered too close. Maybe it was nothing. That night, I locked the door. I double-checked the windows. I kept the fire burning in the stove just for the light. Around midnight, I heard breathing, right outside my bedroom window. Slow, steady breaths, just on the other side of the glass. I didn't move. My body was frozen. My mind screamed at me to grab something, anything, but I was too afraid to make a sound. The breathing stayed for what felt like hours. Then, finally, I heard soft footsteps retreating back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed my bag, threw everything into my car, and started the engine. I didn't care about the money I had spent on the cabin. I just wanted to leave. But when I reached the only road leading out, there was a tree blocking it. A massive pine, freshly fallen. Its trunk splintered like it had been cut. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could walk. It would take hours, but I could make it back to the highway. But that meant going through the trees, and something was out there. I locked my doors and waited in the car. The sun climbed higher, but the feeling didn't go away. The sense that I was being watched. By afternoon, I made up my mind. I was going to hike out. I grabbed a flashlight, my pocket knife, and a bottle of water. Then I started walking. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind. Just my footsteps crunching over the leaves. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. I never saw anything, but I felt it. 2 hours in, I heard something behind me, a branch snapping. I didn't turn around. I picked up my pace. Another snap. Closer. I ran. I didn't stop until I burst out of the trees and onto the highway. A car honked as I stumbled onto the road, waving my arms. A man pulled over, rolling down his window. "Are you okay?" he asked. I couldn't answer. I just nodded and got in. My legs were shaking. As he drove, I turned back to the woods. For a split second, I saw movement between the trees. A figure half hidden in the shadows, watching. Then it was gone. I never went back for my car. I never found out who or what was out there. I didn't want to know. I don't remember exactly when the idea first came to me, but it had been gnawing at me for months. I needed a break from the city, from the constant noise, the sirens, the people. The thought of being alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, sounded like exactly what I needed. Just a week of peace. No phone calls, no emails, no one knocking on my door. Just me, a few books, and the quiet sounds of nature. I rented a cabin about 10 miles from the nearest town. It was deep in the forest, tucked away behind winding dirt roads that seemed to stretch on forever. The rental listing had described it as secluded and peaceful, perfect for getting away from it all. That was exactly what I wanted. The owner had left the keys under a rock near the front door, just as he said he would. The cabin was small but comfortable. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. It smelled like wood and old books, a mix of something comforting and something forgotten. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, walking through the woods, and cooking simple meals. The silence was jarring at first, but I adjusted quickly. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves outside, the creaking of the cabin as it settled, and the distant calls of animals. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, and I liked it that way. On the 3rd night, something changed. I was sitting on the small porch, staring out into the trees, when I noticed it. A single footprint in the dirt just beyond the porch steps. It was fresh, the edges still sharp, and it was bigger than my own foot. It wasn't mine. I hadn't walked that way all day. I told myself it must have been an animal, a bear, maybe, though the print looked too human for that. I didn't want to let my mind get ahead of me. I went inside, locked the door, and made sure all the windows were shut. That night, I slept lightly, waking up every hour to listen. But the woods were quiet, too quiet. By morning, the footprint had been smudged by the wind and shifting dirt. I tried to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing, but a feeling had settled deep in my chest. Something wasn't right. That evening, I sat inside with the fireplace crackling. I hadn't gone for my usual walk. Something about stepping outside felt wrong. Instead, I sat by the window watching the tree line. As the sun dipped lower, the trees became dark shadows against the dimming sky. That was when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the trees. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, half hidden in the branches. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of a person. My stomach turned to ice. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the play of light and shadow had tricked me. But it was there, watching. I moved away from the window slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. My hands shook as I locked the front door, then double-checked the back door. Every window was shut and latched. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. By morning, the figure was gone, but footprints littered the dirt around the cabin. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven back to town. But something in me refused to believe what I was seeing. I had spent my whole life rationalizing things, finding logical explanations. I told myself someone must have wandered onto the property by accident. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. That evening, I forced myself to go outside, just for a moment. I checked around the cabin, looking for any signs that someone had tried to get inside. Nothing. The doors were still locked. The windows were intact. And yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I heard something. A soft tap. Then another. A slow, deliberate knock on the front door. I didn't move. I sat frozen in my chair, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it. The knocking continued, steady, unhurried. Whoever it was knew I was inside. They weren't in a hurry. They were waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag quickly, shoving everything inside without care. When I stepped outside, the cold morning air hit me like a slap. The forest was silent again. But something caught my eye, something new. Carved into the wood of the porch railing, in deep, uneven letters, was a single word: run. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my keys and ran to my car. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I told the local sheriff what had happened. He drove out to the cabin, but when he returned, he just shook his head. There was no sign that anyone had been there. No footprints, no carvings on the railing. Nothing, as if it had all been erased overnight. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I never went back. I didn't want to go up to the cabin alone, but I had no choice. My brother, Derek, was supposed to come with me, but he bailed at the last minute. Said something about work, but I knew it was just an excuse. I couldn't put it off any longer. The repairs had to be done before winter, and if I waited, the snow would make the roads impassable. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of empty road cutting through thick forest. No cell signal, which I expected, but it still made me uneasy. The further I got from town, the more I felt like I was leaving civilization behind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place had been in my family for decades, built by my grandfather and passed down to my dad. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but the sight of it brought back memories. The dark wood walls, the sagging porch, the way the trees crowded around it like they were reclaiming the land. It looked smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of rotting wood. I set my bags down and checked the windows. Some were stuck, others had cracked panes. The worst damage was the back wall. Water had seeped in, warping the boards. That was my main job for the weekend. Fix the wall, patch the roof, get out. I started working as soon as the sun came up. The silence out there was different. It wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. The kind of silence that pressed in on you, made you hyper-aware of every sound. The creak of the trees, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch. Put me on edge, but I kept working. The second night, something felt off. I woke up to a noise outside, something moving through the brush. Probably a deer, maybe a bear, but it didn't sound right. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone was circling the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, but the beam only hit trees. Nothing moved. Sleep didn't come easy after that. Every creak of the old wood made me flinch. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to the isolation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. Human, barefoot. The tracks were fresh, leading from the woods to the cabin and then back again. I followed them a few feet into the trees before they disappeared into the undergrowth. My stomach knotted. Someone had been watching me. I checked the locks, made sure the axe was by the door, then forced myself to keep working. The faster I finished, the sooner I could leave. But the feeling never went away. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside, movement just beyond the treeline. I told myself it was animals. Had to be. But the prince told me otherwise. The fourth day, I found something worse. Near the back of the cabin, where I had been working on the wall, someone had left something for me. A rabbit, gutted and skinned, laid out neatly on the ground. No blood trail, no sign of a struggle. Just the body placed there like a message. I packed my things. I didn't care about the repairs anymore. I just needed to get out. But when I went to start my truck, the battery was dead. I had left the lights off, the doors shut. There was no reason for it to be dead. That was when I heard it. The crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow. Close. I turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the axe and backed toward the cabin. My mind raced. No signal, no help. Just me and whoever was out there. I had to stay inside, had to wait until morning, then figure something out. That night was the worst. I locked the doors, shut the windows, but it didn't matter. I heard them moving outside, closer than before. Footsteps on the porch. The soft creak of wood bending under weight. Then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath, gripping the axe so hard my hands ached. The door didn't open. The footsteps retreated. But I knew they'd be back. The next morning, I found more footprints, circling the cabin. The rabbit was gone. I didn't think. I just grabbed my bag and started walking. 20 miles to the nearest town. No other choice. The whole time I felt them behind me. Not close, but there. Following. Watching. I never saw them, but I knew. I walked fast, barely stopping, heart hammering. By the time I reached the main road, I was shaking. A truck came by an hour later. The driver was an old guy, said I looked like hell. I didn't explain, just asked for a ride. When we reached town, I borrowed a phone and called for a tow. I never went back. I let the cabin rot. Whatever was out there could have it. Some places aren't meant to be fixed. I don't know why I went there alone. Maybe I needed space, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could. Either way, I packed my truck with enough supplies for a week and drove deep into the mountains to an old family cabin. It wasn't anything special, just a small wooden place, tucked into the trees, miles away from the nearest paved road. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a wood stove, a well for water, and an old generator that I hoped still worked. The drive up was rough. The roads were mostly dirt, twisting and narrow, and every time I turned a corner, I expected to see something standing in the middle of the road. Of course, there was nothing, just trees and shadows stretching long in the late afternoon light. I got to the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the peaks. It looked the same as it always had. weathered wood, a sagging roof, the front porch covered in dead leaves and pine needles. I parked, grabbed my bags, and went inside. The air smelled stale, untouched for months. Dust covered the wooden floors, and the furniture had a thin layer of it, too. I went straight to the generator and tried starting it. Nothing. After a few minutes of tinkering, it roared to life, and a single dim light flickered on. I didn't like the silence, so I kept the generator running while I unpacked, stacking my food in the kitchen, setting up my sleeping bag on the old bed, making the place feel a little less empty. The first night was uneventful, cold but fine. The wind pushed against the trees, making them creak. I heard rustling outside, probably animals. The mountains were full of them, deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. I fell asleep with my flashlight next to me, just in case. The next day, I hiked. There was an old trail behind the cabin that wound through the forest, leading up to a ridge with a view of the valley below. It was steep, but I made it up by noon and sat there for a while, listening to the nothingness. No cars, no voices, just the occasional bird call and the wind in the trees. By the time I got back to the cabin, I was tired and hungry. I made a simple meal on the propane stove, sat on the porch, and ate while the sun went down. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground under the trees, just past the clearing, was disturbed, like something had been digging there. I hadn't noticed it before. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a coyote after a burrow or something. That night, I woke up to a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. A distinct, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside the cabin. My stomach tightened. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the window. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then, another sound. Something brushed against the wall outside. A soft, scraping noise. I sat up, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The noise stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting. 10 minutes? 20? Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree branch moving in the wind, or maybe a raccoon climbing around. I forced myself to lie down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, fresh footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. I stared at them, my mind racing. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked around that side of the cabin. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker who got lost and wandered through. But I knew how unlikely that was. Nobody came this deep into the mountains unless they meant to. I spent the day gathering firewood, trying to keep myself busy. Every so often, I glanced at the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the trees and the wind. That night, I locked the door. Not that it would do much, the lock was old, the door itself thin. But it made me feel a little better. I sat in the dark, listening. The generator was off. I didn't want the noise drowning out any sounds outside. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Slow, deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see whatever was out there. The doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the flashlight. My hands were slick with sweat. The rattling stopped, and for a long time there was silence. Then, a single knock. Light, almost polite. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to do something. Make a noise, scare them off, but my body was frozen. Minutes passed. Then, the footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed my things. I didn't care if I had planned to stay a week. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded up the truck, I glanced at the tree line one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure, half hidden behind the trees, watching me. I didn't stop to get a better look. I got in the truck, started the engine, and tore out of there so fast I nearly skidded off the dirt road. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in civilization. I never went back to the cabin. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear it again. A soft knock at the door. I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods. I'm not some city guy who panics when he hears an owl hoot, but there's something about the deep woods that makes you feel small, like you don't belong, like you're being watched. But I needed the weekend away. Work was killing me, stress piling up, and I figured a few days off-grid would do me good. A buddy of mine had a family cabin deep in the mountains, barely used. He told me I could have it for the weekend. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, nature, and a stocked fridge. I drove up late Friday afternoon. The road twisted through the trees, the sun already dipping low. By the time I reached the cabin, the woods were swallowing the last bit of daylight. The cabin was old, built solid, but worn. Wood creaked under my boots as I stepped onto the porch. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect. Rustic furniture, a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio on the counter and a stack of old books. It smelled like pine and dust. The first night was uneventful. I made some dinner, drank a few beers, and read by lantern light. I barely noticed how quiet it was until I went to bed. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Every tiny sound felt huge. The wind against the cabin, the creak of the wood settling. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. Animals skitter. They move in bursts, quick and uncertain. This was different. Slow, steady footsteps, crunching through the leaves. I sat up, heart pounding. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe just my imagination. But I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I shook it off. I went for a short hike, collected some firewood, tried to enjoy myself. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves. That night, I double-checked the locks before getting into bed. Then I heard it again. Same footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer this time, right outside. I held my breath. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but I knew better. The way the footsteps moved, there was a pattern. Someone was out there, listening, watching. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. The porch light cast a weak glow over the trees, but I couldn't see anything past the darkness. I waited, my heart hammering. Then, just barely, I saw it. A shape, a figure standing just beyond the trees. Not moving, just standing. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just watched. Whoever they were watching back. I don't know how long I stood there before they finally stepped back into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. Morning came and I was done. I packed my bag, threw it in the truck, and started the engine. But when I looked down the dirt road, my stomach dropped. Someone had blocked the path. Thick branches, logs, things that weren't there before. I wasn't staying to figure out why. I threw the truck into reverse, planning to back out onto an old side path I had seen earlier. I barely got 20 feet before I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding. My hands clenched the wheel and I refused to turn around. I could see them in the mirror, just standing there. I put the truck in drive. If I had to ram through the branches, I would. But when I looked ahead, my breath caught in my throat. Another figure, standing in front of the truck. I didn't wait. I floored it. The truck jumped forward, the engine roaring as I plowed through the debris. My tires spun on the dirt, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, the cabin far behind me. I never found out who they were, what they wanted, or how long they had been watching me. But I know this. I was never alone out there. I didn't want to stay in the cabin alone, but I had no other choice. It was supposed to be a weekend trip for two. Just me and Sarah, some time away from the city, deep in the woods where there was no cell reception, no distractions, nothing but nature. She had picked out the place, some rental she found online. But then, the night before we were supposed to leave, she called me and said she couldn't make it. Something about a family emergency. I should have canceled, but I didn't. I had already taken the time off work, packed my bags, and driven 2 hours out of the city. And honestly, I wanted the break. The idea of being alone for a couple of days in the middle of nowhere sounded peaceful. The drive up was smooth, But as soon as I pulled off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, I felt uneasy. The road was narrow, just wide enough for my car, and the trees on either side loomed over me, casting long shadows even though it was early afternoon. It took almost 10 minutes to reach the clearing where the cabin sat, a small wooden structure with a porch and a single rocking chair out front. It looked older than I expected, the wood darkened by years of rain and sun. The place was quiet, too quiet. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just stillness. I tried to shake off the unease and got out of the car. The air was crisp, the scent of pine heavy in my nose. The trees were dense, forming a thick wall around the clearing. It was remote, which was what I wanted, or at least what I thought I wanted. The inside of the cabin was simple, just a small kitchen, a living area with an old couch and a bedroom in the back. The bathroom was tiny, with a rusty shower head and a mirror that was so scratched up it barely reflected anything. There was no TV, no radio, no Wi-Fi, just me and my thoughts. I spent the first few hours settling in, unpacking my bags, checking out the surroundings. There was a shed behind the cabin, locked up tight with a heavy-duty padlock. I tried not to think about what might be inside. Instead, I sat on the porch with a beer and watched the trees. The silence was unnerving. Even in the city, late at night, there was always some noise, cars in the distance, sirens, people talking. Out here, there was nothing. It started getting dark around 6. The sun dipped below the trees, and shadows stretched across the clearing. I went inside and lit a few candles. The cabin had power, but I didn't trust the old wiring. I cooked some instant noodles, ate in silence, then went to bed early. That's when I heard it. A thump. Soft but unmistakable, came from outside. I sat up in bed, listening. Then another thump, closer this time. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a deer wandering too close to the cabin. But something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't a shuffle, not the rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. It was deliberate, heavy. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, ears straining for any other noise. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw the footprints. They weren't mine. A single set, deep in the damp soil, leading from the tree line to the porch. They stopped just at the edge of the steps. I looked around, heart hammering in my chest. The woods were empty, nothing but trees stretching in every direction. I had locked the door before going to bed. I checked it again. It was still locked. I told myself it had to be a hunter or some lost hiker. Maybe someone saw my car and wanted to check if I was home. But that didn't explain why they stopped at the porch and never knocked. I tried to shake it off, made breakfast, drank coffee, but the feeling of being watched never left me. By midday, I decided to go for a walk. Maybe getting out of the cabin would help clear my head. I followed a small trail leading away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, the path barely visible in some places. I walked for about 20 minutes before I saw something strange. Tarp. It was old, weathered, half covered in leaves. I stepped closer, nudging it with my foot. Underneath was a pile of empty food cans, plastic bottles, a few torn pieces of clothing. Someone had been here, recently. My stomach tightened. I turned back, walking faster this time. I didn't want to run, didn't want to panic, but I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. I didn't look back. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door. I didn't go back outside for the rest of the day. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The wind, the creak of the wooden walls settling. And then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Thump, louder this time. Right outside the door. I held my breath. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. The rattling stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't move from the couch, gripping the knife so hard my hand went numb. When the sun came up, I opened the door. The footprints were back. More this time. pacing in front of the cabin. I packed my bags and left. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I didn't care if Sarah thought I was overreacting. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove. As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man stood at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I drove until I saw highway signs and cell reception bars on my phone. I never went back, and I never will. I was supposed to be alone. That was the whole point of this trip. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week, far from the noise of the city. No cell service, no internet, just quiet. I wanted to reset my mind, clear my head, get away from everything. The place was as isolated as it could be. A 10-mile dirt road leading from the nearest town. The last few miles so rough and narrow I had to leave my car halfway up and hike the rest. It was simple but comfortable. A single room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, and a bed pushed up against the back wall. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a single window looking out into the trees. The air smelled fresh, pine mixed with damp earth, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. It was perfect. The first day was peaceful. I sat outside with a book, made a fire as the sun went down, and cooked a simple meal. When it got dark, it was dark. No streetlights, no distant glow of civilization, just pure blackness stretching in every direction. It felt strange at first, but comforting in a way. The first night, I slept deeply. The second night, I woke up to a sound. It was subtle, just a soft rustling, like something moving through the leaves outside. I brushed it off as an animal, probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I turned over and went back to sleep. The third night, I heard it again. But this time it was closer. It wasn't just rustling, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound, but it never came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was paranoia. When you're alone in the woods, your mind plays tricks on you. I forced myself to sleep. The fourth night, things changed. I locked the door before bed like always, checked it twice. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, the door was slightly open. I sat up, my heart hammering. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. The cabin was small, 1 room. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. I reached for my flashlight and swept it around. The door creaked as it moved slightly in the wind. I stood up, walked over, and shut it, locked it again. This time, I pushed a chair against it, just in case. The next morning, I found footprints outside. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked around the cabin since I arrived. These were fresh, leading from the tree line straight to my door. They stopped just outside, then turned back the way they came. I stared at them for a long time. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a lost hiker? A hunter? But why would they come all the way here, in the middle of the night, and just stand outside my door? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening. The woods were silent. No wind, no rustling, just dead silence. I kept my flashlight next to me, my pocket knife in my hand. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of the chair scraping against the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the door. The chair had moved. Just a few inches, but it had moved. The door was still locked. I stayed frozen, listening. Then, from outside, I heard it. A slow, steady tapping, knuckles against wood. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't forceful. Just a slow, rhythmic tap, 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 like whoever was out there knew I was awake. I didn't move. The tapping continued for what felt like forever, then stopped. Silence stretched on. I held my breath, waiting for something else. A footstep, the sound of retreating footsteps, but there was nothing. I sat there, gripping my knife, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough, I opened the door. The footprints were back, the same ones, leading up to the door, stopping, then turning back. I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for the full week. I didn't care that my car was miles down the trail. I threw everything into my backpack and started walking. Fast. The whole way I felt like I was being watched. The trees felt taller, the shadows deeper. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in town, that I finally let out a breath. I checked into a motel that night, double-checked the lock 3 times before going to bed. I never told anyone about it. What would I say? That someone had been watching me? That someone had stood outside my cabin for nights in a row? Knocking, waiting? Sounded crazy. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know I will never go back to that cabin again. I rented the cabin for a week. I had been wanting to get away for a while, away from the city, away from the noise, and away from people. Work had been draining me, and the thought of escaping into the woods for a bit felt like the perfect solution. I found the place online. A small, isolated cabin up in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest. The listing promised peace, solitude, and no cell service. That last part was supposed to be a selling point. At the time, it was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took longer than I expected. The roads became narrower as I climbed higher into the mountains, the trees thickening on both sides. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, it was already getting dark. My tires crunched over gravel as I pulled up in front of the place. It was smaller than I thought it would be, just a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a small porch. A single yellow light glowed above the door. I sat in the car for a moment, looking around. The forest pressed in from all sides, the trees tall and unmoving. The silence was thick. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and took in the cool air. The only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. No cars, no distant hum of the city, just quiet. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The inside was basic but comfortable. A small kitchenette, a fireplace, a couch, and a single bed against the far wall. The air smelled like wood and dust. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked my phone. No signal, just like the listing said. That was fine. That was what I wanted. I spent the first night relaxing. I made some food, lit a fire, and sat on the couch with a book. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees groan. The cabin creaked occasionally, but that was normal. Old buildings settle with shifts. I told myself not to overthink it. The first full day was peaceful. I went for a hike, took some photos, and enjoyed the solitude. I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway, and it felt good to be alone. That night, I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the woods. The wind had died down, leaving only the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. The stars were bright, the sky clear. Everything felt calm. Then, around midnight, I heard something, a sound that didn't fit. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the occasional creaks of the cabin. But after a while, I was sure I wasn't hearing things. It was coming from outside, a shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I sat up in bed, listening. My heartbeat thumped in my ears. The sound stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then, after a long pause, it started again. Closer this time. I got up and moved to the window. The porch light barely reached beyond the steps, but I could see the trees and the dirt path leading away from the cabin. Nothing moved. I stood there for a while, watching. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something, a shape just at the edge of the tree line. Still, watching, my stomach tightened. It was too dark to make out details, but it was definitely a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I stepped back from the window. My breath came fast. I told myself it could be a hunter, a hiker who got lost. But why would they just stand there? Why wouldn't they call out for help? I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness as I pointed it toward the trees. But by the time the light reached the spot where the figure had been, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the flashlight by my side, ears straining for any sound. but nothing else happened. By morning, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the shadows. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone. The second night, I locked the door and windows, double-checking everything before getting into bed. I kept the flashlight close again. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something tapping. Not on the door, on the window. A soft, deliberate tap. Then silence. Then another. I sat up, my chest tight. The window was right next to the bed. I didn't want to look. My brain screamed at me not to, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head. The window was small, just above the bed frame. Outside, the darkness pressed against the glass. And then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A handprint, smudged against the glass. The breath caught in my throat. My skin went cold. I scrambled out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and shined it at the window. Nothing. The print was still there, but whoever had left it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the couch, every light in the cabin on, listening to the silence outside. At sunrise, I packed my things. I had paid for a week, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying another night. As I carried my bag to the car, I stopped. The ground around the cabin was soft from the rain the day before, and in the dirt, leading from the window to the trees, were footprints. Bare footprints. I didn't stick around to see where they led. I got in my car and drove, gravel spitting from my tires as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back, never contacted the owner. I left a review saying the place was nice and quiet, just as advertised. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know this. I wasn't as alone as I thought. I drove out to the cabin on a Friday afternoon. The sky an endless gray stretch above me. It was a 6-hour drive from my apartment, cutting through long, empty highways and winding forest roads. The farther I got from the city, the quieter the world became. My cell service dropped to 1 bar, then none. I didn't mind. In fact, I wanted that. A week away from people, away from everything. Just me, the cabin, and the woods. The place belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I barely knew, but they were letting me stay there for free as long as I locked up when I left. It was an old, 1-story log cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any electricity, just a small generator for lights and a propane tank for the stove. No one would be around. That was the point. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, covered in deep tire grooves from previous visitors. My car bounced over the uneven ground, tree branches reaching out like fingers. I arrived as the sun was beginning to set. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by nothing but towering pines. It had a porch with an old rocking chair, a metal roof streaked with rust, and a single window with yellowed curtains. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. It smelled like wood, dust, and something faintly damp, like old leaves left to rot. The inside was small but functional. A couch pushed against one wall, a fireplace in the corner, a small kitchen with a gas stove. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress, a wooden dresser, and a tiny window looking out into the trees. I unpacked quickly, throwing my clothes in the dresser, setting my flashlight and pocket knife on the nightstand. I wasn't worried about anything. The doors had sturdy locks. The windows were small. There was a rifle above the fireplace, though I doubted I'd need it. The first night was peaceful. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I slept with the window cracked open, the cool air easing me into a deep sleep. The second day, I went hiking. I followed a narrow deer trail into the woods, moving slowly, listening to the quiet. The forest was dense, sunlight barely breaking through the canopy. I found a stream about a mile in, clear water rushing over smooth stones. I sat there for a while just listening. Felt good to be alone. On my way back, I saw something strange. At first, it looked like a shadow in the trees. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. But as I moved closer, I saw it was something else. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, deep gouges. The marks were too high for a deer, too wide for a bear. Something sharp had done this. A knife, maybe, or claws. I stared at it for a while before moving on. There was no reason to be scared. People came through these woods all the time. Hunters, hikers. Maybe someone was marking a trail. That night, I locked the doors. On the third day, I found more marks. I was out gathering firewood when I saw them. More trees, all scraped raw. Some deeper than the one before, like whatever made them was getting more aggressive. That uneasy feeling crawled up my spine, but I shook it off. There were animals in these woods. Maybe it was just something I hadn't seen before. That night, I heard something outside, a rustling just beyond the porch. Not the wind, not a raccoon or a deer, something heavier. I sat up in bed, my breath tight in my chest. The rifle was still above the fireplace. I didn't move, I just listened. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate step, then another, and then nothing. I stayed awake for hours, waiting, but whatever it was, it didn't come closer. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, human ones, bare feet pressing deep into the soil. They led from the tree line to my porch, then back into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. No one should be out here. There were no nearby houses, no campsites, nothing. I locked the doors again. On the fifth night, I woke up to breathing. Not mine, not inside the cabin. Outside, right by my window. Slow, deep breaths. I didn't move. My body felt frozen, every hair on my arms standing up. I listened as the breathing continued, steady and unhurried. Then a tap, light, almost playful. Fingertips against the glass. I gripped the knife under my pillow, heart pounding. The tapping stopped. The breathing faded. But I didn't sleep. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bags, threw everything into my car. I didn't care if I was overreacting. Something was wrong. Someone was out there, watching me. I got in the car, turned the key. The engine sputtered. Then nothing. I tried again, and again. Dead. Panic clawed at my chest. I popped the hood, checked the battery. The cables were gone. Someone had taken them. I looked at the cabin, at the forest, at the endless stretch of trees. And then I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I ran down the dirt road, heart slamming against my ribs. The nearest highway was miles away, but I didn't care. I wasn't staying there another night. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the road. My body ached, my lungs burned, but I kept moving. At dawn, I saw headlights, a truck slowing as it approached. The driver was an older man, his face lined with years of hard work. He let me in. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. I never went back to the cabin. A week later, I checked the news. A hiker had gone missing in those woods. They never found him. The cabin was miles from anything. That's what I wanted. No traffic, no city noise, no people. Just quiet. I booked it for a week. A small wooden place deep in the woods, tucked far enough away that the only way in was a winding dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. The online listing showed pictures of a rustic interior, wooden floors, a fireplace, a little kitchen. It looked perfect. The drive out there took most of the afternoon. The deeper I went, the rougher the road became. The trees closed in, swallowing the light. I had to slow down to keep from bouncing too hard over ruts. My phone had lost service miles back. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the place looked just like the photos. Simple, one-story with a slanted metal roof. A porch wrapped around the front, and a small stack of firewood leaned against the railing. The air smelled damp and earthy, a mix of pine and wet leaves. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The place was clean but old. The floors creaked under my boots. A single window over the sink let in what little light was left. I found the light switch and flicked it on. The bulbs overhead flickered before settling into a dim glow. I spent the first hour getting settled. Unpacked my bag, set my knife on the kitchen counter, checked the cabinets. Canned food, matches, a few old pots, basic supplies. I started a fire in the fireplace and sat in the chair next to it, listening to the crackling wood. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. It was peaceful. The first night was fine, a little too quiet. I wasn't used to the absolute stillness. No cars, no voices, just the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke up to cold air and glowing embers in the fireplace. I locked the front door, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up to something moving outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I held my breath and listened. It wasn't the wind. The steps were too steady, too purposeful. I sat up, heart hammering. The cabin was completely dark except for a thin strip of moonlight slipping through the window. I stayed still, ears straining. The steps moved around the side of the cabin. My breath came shallow. A deer, maybe, or some other animal. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my window. I didn't move, didn't blink. My skin prickled. Long seconds passed. Then the slow sound of footsteps moving away, back into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then sat up and grabbed my flashlight. I wanted to look, but at the same time I didn't. Instead, I locked the door again, made sure all the windows were shut, and stayed awake until morning. Daylight made the fear seem stupid. There were no signs of anything outside. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. No tracks, nothing unusual. Maybe it really had been an animal. The second night, I brought my knife to bed with me. I barely slept. Every little sound made my nerves spike. A branch snapped somewhere outside, but nothing came close. Still, I felt watched. By the third day, I started noticing little things. The firewood stack on the porch looked different, like someone had taken a few logs. A can in the kitchen I didn't remember using sat on the counter. The back door, one I never used, felt loose, like it hadn't been shut all the way. I told myself I was imagining it. Cabin fever, isolation messing with my head. But that night, something woke me up again. A noise from the front porch. Not footsteps this time, something softer, a slow, dragging sound. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing. I stood, heart pounding, and moved toward the door. I wanted to look to see what was out there. The dragging sound stopped. Silence. Then a soft tap against the wood. Not a knock. Something lighter. Fingertips. I backed away, turned off the light, and gripped my knife. My breathing was too loud. I felt frozen, waiting. Then, just as slowly as it started, the tapping stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The fire burned low, but I didn't move to add wood. I just sat watching the door, waiting for morning. By the fourth day, I decided to leave. I had booked the place for a week, but I didn't care. I packed my bag, stuffed my knife into my jacket, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw the footprints, barefoot, human, leading up to my door, and then back into the trees. No car tracks, no signs of anyone else, just those prints. I locked the door behind me, got in my truck, and drove. The trees felt too close, the road too narrow. My hands were tight on the wheel. I didn't relax until I hit pavement. I never went back, never reported it. The listing for the cabin disappeared a week later. Sometimes I think about those footprints, about the tapping, about whoever or whatever was out there, and I wonder if they ever found someone else. I was hiking alone in the Cascade Mountains, deep in the wilderness where the trails thinned out and cell service was long gone. I had planned the trip for months, poring over maps, watching weather reports, and packing all the essentials. I wasn't new to this. Solo hiking had become my escape from the noise of life. There was something about the quiet, the endless trees, the fresh mountain air that kept me coming back. But this time, something felt off, even from the beginning. The first day was uneventful. I started my hike early, feeling strong, my pack sitting comfortably on my shoulders. The trail wound through dense evergreens, sunlight filtering through the canopy, dappling the ground in patches of gold. Birds chirped, a stream gurgled somewhere off to my right, and I settled into a steady rhythm. By noon, I had covered a good distance and took a short break on a flat rock overlooking a valley. That's when I first noticed it. Something subtle, something easy to ignore. A faint rustling in the trees, too steady to be the wind. I turned, scanning the forest, but saw nothing. Just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I chalked it up to an animal and moved on. As the afternoon wore on, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led up toward the ridgeline, the other dipped into a valley. I chose the ridgeline, knowing the views would be worth it. The climb was tough, my legs burning as I ascended. The air grew cooler and the wind picked up. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a cluster of boulders, with a breathtaking view of the mountains in the distance. As I unpacked my tent, that same rustling sound returned. This time it was closer. I stood still, listening. It was distinct now, slow, deliberate steps moving just beyond the tree line. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe an elk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. Night fell quickly in the mountains. I ate a quick meal, the sky shifting from deep blue to inky black. The stars were brilliant, the kind of display you only see far from civilization. But I couldn't enjoy it. My nerves were on edge. The sounds in the trees had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening. The wind howled through the trees, but underneath it, I swore I heard something else. Something moving just beyond my camp. Then, a distinct crunch of leaves. Someone was out there. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps circled my tent, slow, careful. Not an animal, not a bear, person. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to call out, to scare them off, but fear kept me silent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, I packed up and left, moving fast, my head on a swivel. I took a different route back, avoiding the ridge, cutting through a narrow valley instead. The whole time I felt watched. The trees pressed in, the silence unnatural. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, too fresh, and not mine. They led off the trail, disappearing into the trees. My stomach twisted. Someone had been following me. Maybe they still were. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My map showed a service road a few miles ahead. If I could reach it, I could follow it down to the highway. Then something caught my eye. A small, weathered campsite just off the trail. No tent, just a few scattered belongings. An old backpack, some torn fabric, rusted cooking supplies. And in the dirt, more footprints leading away. I didn't stop, couldn't. For hours, I hiked nonstop, my legs screaming, lungs burning. I reached the service road just as the sun began to set, the sky bleeding orange and red. I didn't feel safe until I heard the distant hum of a car engine. When I finally made it back to my truck, parked at the trailhead, I locked the doors and just sat there, catching my breath. My hands were shaking. The next day, I reported what I saw to the rangers. They listened, nodded, took notes. Then one of them, an older guy with weathered skin and tired eyes, said something that chilled me. We get reports like this every now and then. Campers going missing, footprints where they shouldn't be. Sometimes we find abandoned camps like the one you saw. Sometimes we don't. I asked if they ever found out who was out there. He just shook his head. Not usually. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I never thought a solo hike would turn into the worst experience of my life. I had always been an outdoors person, spending weekends exploring trails and pushing myself further each time. There was something about being alone in nature that made me feel at peace. But looking back, I was naive. The wilderness doesn't care about your confidence. It doesn't care if you think you know what you're doing. It doesn't care about you at all. This hike was supposed to be a challenge. A long, difficult trail winding through dense forest, climbing up rugged hills, and following an old, barely maintained path that most people avoided. I had read about it online. Some described it as beautiful and peaceful, while others warned about how easy it was to get lost. But I had experience. I had gear. I had studied the maps and prepared for the worst, or so I thought. I set out early, the morning air crisp and cool. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food for a couple of days, a tent, a sleeping bag, a GPS, a paper map as a backup, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't planning on spending the night, but I liked to be prepared. My phone had no signal out here, but that was expected. That was part of the appeal. No distractions, no noise, just me and the trail. The first few hours were perfect. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Birds called to each other in the canopy above. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through towering trees and crossing small streams. I felt good, strong, confident. Then, about 6 miles in, things started to change. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The path became harder to follow, overgrown in places, forcing me to slow down. I checked my GPS, still on track, but something felt off. The air was different, heavy. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook it off and pressed on, following the trail as best as I could. An hour later, I reached a small clearing where I planned to rest. There was an old fire pit in the center, long abandoned. Someone had been here before, but not recently. I sat down, drank some water, and ate a protein bar. That's when I noticed the first sign of trouble. A boot print in the dirt. Fresh, not mine. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier that morning. It was possible, but unlikely. This trail wasn't popular. Still, I told myself it was nothing. I finished my break and kept moving. The trail became even worse after that. The trees seemed closer together, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like fingers reaching for my ankles. I had to watch my step constantly. The further I went, the less the path resembled a trail at all. It felt more like I was forcing my way through untouched wilderness. But my GPS still showed I was heading in the right direction. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark blue. It looked like part of a jacket. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. The edges were frayed, but it wasn't old. It hadn't been there long. I didn't like that. Not one bit. Something inside me whispered that I should turn back. But I had come too far to quit now. The map showed that the trail looped around a ridge before heading back toward the start. If I turned around, I'd have to retrace miles of difficult terrain. If I kept going, I'd be back at my car before nightfall. I made the wrong choice. As I pushed forward, the terrain got worse. The ground sloped upward, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on loose dirt and rocks. My breathing grew heavy. Sweat dripped down my back. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I stopped, listened. My pulse pounded in my ears. Nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, long and shifting in the dimming light. I saw no movement, no sign of anything unusual. But I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I forced myself to keep going, my pace quicker, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked my GPS again. It had lost signal. That wasn't supposed to happen. It had worked fine earlier. I pulled out my paper map, but I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail was gone. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I had to keep moving. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A structure. It was small and partially hidden among the trees. An old wooden shelter, maybe, or the remains of a hunting cabin. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated. Going inside was the last thing I wanted to do. But night was coming fast, and I had lost the trail. I needed to get my bearings, check my map properly, maybe even wait until morning. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. A rusted lantern sat on a broken table. The place had been abandoned for years. Then I saw the footprints in the dust. Not mine. Someone had been here. Recently. A sharp, cold fear settled in my stomach. I backed toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming to get out. That's when I heard the breathing. Slow, heavy, right behind me. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that forest. I don't remember how long I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches slashing at my arms, lungs burning. I just ran. Somehow I found the trail again. Somehow I made it back to my car. I don't even remember unlocking the door, just slamming it behind me and peeling out of that empty parking lot, gravel spraying behind my tires. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that breathing. I had planned this hike for months. The route was a long, rugged trail cutting through deep forests and winding up into the mountains. It was supposed to take 3 days, covering nearly 30 miles of wilderness. I had done similar hikes before, but this one was different. It was remote. No designated campsites, no cell service, and no quick way out if something went wrong. That was the appeal, though complete isolation. I packed everything I needed. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, enough food for 5 days just in case, and a GPS device that worked via satellite. My backpack was heavy, but I had trained for this. I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The first day went smoothly. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The trail was well-defined, winding through dense trees and occasionally opening up to views of the valley below. I made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp beside a small stream. I ate a quick meal, stretched my sore legs, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the sun dipped below the trees. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise, a snapping twig. Not unusual in the woods. Animals move around constantly, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the quick rustle of a small creature. It was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and moved on, shaking off the unease from the night before. The trail grew steeper, and the forest thickened. The further I went, the more untouched it felt. By late afternoon, I reached a high ridge and paused to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something strange. Off the trail, maybe 50 yards into the trees, there was a clearing. A small, unnatural-looking clearing. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped off the trail to take a closer look. As I neared, I saw the ground was bare. No grass, no leaves, just exposed dirt. And in the center, there were deep scratches in the soil. Not animal tracks, not claw marks, but long, straight gouges, like someone had dragged something heavy through it. My stomach tightened. It didn't look like a place people camped. It looked like a place where something had been buried or dug up. I turned and walked back to the trail, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch sent a chill up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I set up camp earlier than planned. I found a relatively open spot, not wanting to be too close to the thick trees. I made a small fire, ate, and tried to relax. The unease from earlier lingered, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. Then I woke up again. This time I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps circling my tent. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my hand. I listened. The steps stopped. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I started to convince myself it was an animal, I heard something worse. Breathing. Not heavy, not exaggerated, just soft, slow breathing right outside my tent. I stayed completely still. My brain screamed at me to do something, to get up, to make noise, to scare whatever it was away. But I couldn't move. I just lay there, heart hammering, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting at any second to see a shadow move against it. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, gripping my knife, waiting for morning. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed my gear and left. I abandoned my planned route. I just wanted to get out. The problem was I had hiked deep into the mountains, and the fastest way out was forward. So I kept going, moving as fast as I could without running. Midday, I saw something else that made my stomach drop. Boot prints. Fresh ones. Not mine. Not from a hiker. They were too wide, too deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. And they weren't following the trail. They came from the woods, crossed over the path, and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't stop to think. I just kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the final stretch of the trail, a long descent leading to a small parking area where my car was waiting. Relief flooded me. I picked up the pace. I was almost out, almost safe. Then, just as I neared the last bend, I noticed something. A man, standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I just walked as fast as I could, forcing myself not to break into a run. My car was just ahead. I could see it. As I reached for my keys, I glanced back. He was gone. I didn't waste a second. I threw my pack in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I forced myself not to look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. I never went back to that trail. I never reported it. I don't know what I saw, what I heard, or what would have happened if I had stayed another night. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I parked my truck at the base of the mountain. It was early, too early for most people to be out here, and that was exactly why I chose this time. I liked hiking alone. No distractions, no conversations, just me, the trail, and the quiet. I had been planning this trip for weeks. The trail wasn't well known, which made it perfect. I wanted isolation, something raw and untouched. A friend had mentioned it once, saying he had heard about it from some old-timer at a gas station. No official maps listed it, but I had scoured satellite images and pieced together a route. The hike wasn't supposed to be easy, but I liked a challenge. I strapped on my backpack, double-checked my supplies, water, snacks, first aid, knife, emergency whistle, GPS, and my phone with an external battery. The service was non-existent up here, but I had downloaded offline maps. Everything was set. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The trail was overgrown but manageable. Birds chirped in the trees, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. I felt good. The incline started to get steeper, but I welcomed the burn in my legs. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. A single boot, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. It was old and weathered, the leather cracked and peeling. The laces were missing, and inside, I could see what looked like animal droppings. It had been here for a while. I nudged it with my boot before moving on, chalking it up to some careless hunter losing their gear. An hour later, I found the second one. It wasn't another boot this time. It was a backpack, torn open, its contents scattered. A jacket, a crushed water bottle, some granola bar wrappers. I knelt down, examining it. The fabric had been ripped apart, not just from age, but violently, as if something had clawed or chewed through it. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I wasn't the first person to come through here. Someone else had, and they had left in a hurry. I checked the area, scanning the trees and underbrush. Nothing. No sounds beyond the usual forest noises. I kept going. The higher I climbed, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of everything. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind whistling through the trees. Then I smelled it, something rotten, thick and cloying. It wasn't the usual decay of a dead animal. It was worse, stronger, the kind that made your stomach churn. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and kept walking. And then I saw it. A tent, or what was left of one. The fabric was shredded. The poles snapped like twigs. Clothes and camping gear were strewn everywhere, mixed with dirt and leaves. There was no sign of anyone. I crouched down, examining the wreckage. A sleeping bag lay partially unzipped, dirt and twigs clinging to the fabric. I nudged it open with the end of a stick, my heart pounding. No one inside, but there was something else. Deep gouges in the ground, leading away from the campsite, like something had been dragged. My gut told me to turn back, but I was stubborn. Maybe someone got hurt, an animal attack, something explainable. Maybe they needed help. I followed the marks. They led into the trees, weaving through the underbrush. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got. Flies buzzed in the thick, stagnant air. Then I saw the first bone. It was small, too small to be human. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. It was clean, stripped of all flesh. Nearby, another, then another. The trail ended at a small clearing. Pile of bones. Not just animals. My breath caught in my throat. There were human bones among them. Some bleached white, others still bearing shreds of flesh. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all piled together like discarded leftovers. I turned and ran. I don't know how far I got before I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, somewhere between a growl and a breath. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My only thought was getting out. The trail blurred past me, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then the smell again, stronger this time. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Something moved in the trees. Not an animal, not a person, something else. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I don't even remember unlocking the door, just that I was inside, slamming it shut, locking it, my chest heaving. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Later that night, when I finally calmed down, I tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was a wild animal, a bear, or a mountain lion. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe the bones were from old hunting kills, the wrecked campsite just some unlucky hiker who got lost. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in those woods, and I was never going back. I had been planning the solo hike for months. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Disconnect from everything, get away from people, and just lose myself in the wilderness for a few days. I picked a remote trail deep in the mountains, one that wasn't too popular but still had enough markers to keep me from getting completely lost. I packed carefully, enough food for 4 days, a sturdy tent, extra clothes, a map, and a satellite phone just in case. Everything was set. The first day went as expected. I followed the marked trail, winding up through thick forests, the smell of damp earth filling my nose. The air was cool, and the silence was thick, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt good to be out there alone, away from everything. No traffic, no talking, no distractions. Just me and nature. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small stream and decided to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I built a small fire, ate one of my packed meals, and watched the sky darken. The stars came out bright, and I sat there for a while, just taking it all in. That night, I slept fine, only waking up a couple of times to the sound of distant animals moving through the brush. Nothing unusual. The second day, I moved deeper into the trail. It was steeper here, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. The trees grew closer together, and the farther I went, the quieter everything became. Even the birds seemed less active. Around midday, I stopped to rest near a ridge, drinking water and checking the map. I was still on the right path, though I noticed the markers were becoming less frequent. It wasn't concerning yet, but I made a mental note to be more cautious. A few hours later, things started to feel off. At first, it was just a feeling, like the woods had suddenly grown heavier around me. The silence was thicker, like the air itself was pressing in. I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I kept hiking, the feeling didn't go away. I noticed something strange about the trees. Some of them had deep gouges in the bark, like something had been scraping against them. Not claw marks, something larger, almost like a tool had hacked into them. The cuts were old, darkened with age, but they were everywhere. I didn't remember reading anything about logging in this area. Then, I found the first thing that made my stomach tighten. A torn piece of fabric, tangled in a bush just off the trail. It was faded and weathered, but it looked like it had once been part of a jacket or a backpack. Someone had been through here before. I figured it could have been from another hiker, maybe someone who had passed through years ago. But then I found more. A few yards ahead, another piece of fabric, this one caught on a low-hanging branch. Then a rusted-out canteen, half buried in the dirt. A single hiking boot, the sole nearly falling off. It wasn't just random trash, this was someone's gear. And it was old. I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't alone out here, not in the way I had expected. Someone had been here before, and they had left in a hurry. I decided to keep going. Turning back now didn't seem necessary, and I still had plenty of daylight left. I told myself it was probably just lost gear from hikers who had gotten careless. People drop things all the time, right? The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and loose rocks. The wind had picked up slightly, sending a low whistle through the trees. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A backpack. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, half covered in dirt and leaves. It had been there for a long time. The fabric was torn, the zippers rusted. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was open, and inside there was still food. Old, rotting, covered in mold, but still recognizable. No one leaves their food behind in the wilderness unless they're planning on coming back. Except no one had. I took a slow step forward, my heart pounding. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The forest was still too still. I crouched down and poked through the bag carefully. There were clothes, faded and damp, and a small notebook, its pages ruined by moisture. I flipped through it, but the ink had bled too much to make out any words. The only thing I could read was a date on the inside cover, 1997. This bag had been sitting here for over 20 years. I stood up fast, my breath shallow. That tight feeling in my chest had turned into full-blown panic. Someone had been out here and they had never made it back. I turned to head back the way I came, Screw finishing the hike. I wasn't about to become the next missing person in these woods. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping, not behind me, ahead. I froze. The sound had come from somewhere just beyond the trees off the trail. I scanned the area, my pulse hammering. I couldn't see anything. Then another sound, closer this time, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I turned and started walking fast, my mind racing. I didn't run, not yet. Running could lead to a twisted ankle, a fall. I needed to stay focused. But then the sounds behind me grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, uneven, like someone was following me, but trying not to be heard. I broke into a full sprint. I don't know how long I ran. The trail blurred past me, my breath burning in my chest. I ignored the sharp branches cutting into my arms, the pain in my legs. I just ran. Eventually, I saw it, the clearing where I had camped the night before. My tent was still there, my pack, everything. I grabbed my gear, heart pounding, and didn't stop moving. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back at my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove until I was miles away from that place. I never went back. Later, I did some digging. That trail had a history of disappearances, dating back decades. People who had gone in and never come out. No one ever found their bodies, just their gear, left behind like they had vanished into thin air. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to find out. I had been planning this hike for weeks. A solo trip into the mountains, away from the constant noise of the city, away from people. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the feeling of being completely alone with nature. It was supposed to be a weekend trip. Nothing too intense, just 2 days of hiking and a night camping in the wilderness before heading back to my car. I arrived early in the morning, my backpack stuffed with supplies. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. It was the kind of weather that made you feel lucky to be outside. The trail I had chosen was an old one, not the kind of well-maintained paths that families and casual hikers used. This one was isolated, rugged, and barely marked. That's why I picked it. I wanted to be alone. The first few hours were perfect. The sound of birds, the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I had that satisfying feeling of my muscles working, my breath steady. I wasn't thinking about work, about emails, about anything. Just me and the trail. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock overlooking a valley and sat down, pulling out a sandwich from my pack. The view was incredible. Rolling hills, dense trees, and in the distance, the faint shimmer of a river. There was no one around. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. It was exactly what I wanted. I was careful to pack up my trash, making sure I left no sign I had been there. I had another 5 or 6 miles to cover before I reached the spot where I planned to camp for the night. I strapped my pack back on and continued down the trail. That's when I first noticed something was off. I wasn't sure what it was at first, just a feeling, a slight unease. The forest was still a little too still. No birds, no rustling, just my own footsteps. It's strange how quickly silence can become unsettling when you're alone in the wilderness. I tried to shake it off. Sometimes the woods just get quiet. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a fox or a coyote. I kept walking. Another hour passed. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not sure why. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then I saw it. A footprint. It was on the trail, clear as day, and it wasn't mine. It was fresh. The dirt was still soft around the edges, undisturbed by wind or time. I stopped, staring at it. I had been hiking for hours and hadn't seen a single person. This trail wasn't popular, and there were no other cars parked at the trailhead when I arrived. So where did this footprint come from? I swallowed, my mouth dry. Maybe someone else had taken a different route up here. Maybe they had come and gone earlier in the day. But if that were the case, why did the footprint look so fresh? I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was still quiet. Too quiet. My skin prickled. I took a slow breath and kept moving, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Another mile passed, and I found another footprint. This time, it was off the trail, just barely visible in the underbrush. It was like someone had stepped away from the path and into the trees, and they had been barefoot. My stomach tightened. I bent down, examining the print closely. The toes, the arch, it was definitely a human footprint. But who the hell was walking barefoot out here, miles from civilization? I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees around me seemed taller, darker. I scanned the forest, looking for movement. Nothing, just endless trees and shadows. I picked up my pace. Another mile. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I needed to find a place to camp soon. I had planned to reach a small clearing near a stream, but now I wasn't sure I wanted to stop at all. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to go back. But that would mean hiking in the dark, and that was even more dangerous. I kept moving. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. Not behind me, ahead. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I scanned the trail, the trees. Nothing, but someone was there. I knew it. The sound hadn't come from an animal. It was deliberate, controlled. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound was gone. The forest was silent again. My skin crawled. I needed to get out of there. I turned and started walking back the way I came, faster this time. I no longer cared about finishing the hike. I just wanted to reach my car. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, like invisible eyes pressing against my back. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, standing in the trees, the footprints, the silence, the snapping branch. I had been followed, and then, in the dim light, I saw it, a figure, half hidden behind a tree, just off the trail, barefoot, standing completely still, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, my backpack bouncing against my back. I didn't care. I sprinted down the trail, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs screamed and the world blurred around me. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting untouched, I nearly sobbed. I fumbled with my keys, threw my pack in the back, and tore out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I had always loved hiking. There was something about being out in the wild, surrounded by towering trees, endless trails, and the quiet hum of nature that made me feel alive. The solitude, the challenge. It was the perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. This time, I had picked a trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't a well-known spot, just a long, winding path leading into the dense forest. I had found it on an old map in a used bookstore. No online reviews, no GPS markers, just a thin, dotted line cutting through a blank stretch of wilderness. That was exactly what I wanted. Something untouched, something real. I started early in the morning, my pack loaded with supplies. I had my tent, enough food for 3 days, a good knife, and all the gear I needed. The plan was simple: follow the trail as far as I could, set up camp, and head back the next day. I was prepared for anything, or at least I thought I was. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, the sun warm but not too hot. The path was narrow but well-trodden, winding through towering pines. Every so often, I would stop to listen to the sounds of the forest, birds calling, the distant rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. Felt peaceful. But around noon, things started to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind in the trees, began to fade. At first, I figured it was just the change in elevation, maybe the density of the trees muffling the noise. But after another half hour, I realized it wasn't just quieter. It was dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. I stopped and looked around. The trees were thicker here, taller. The sunlight barely reached the ground, casting long shadows that seemed darker than they should be. I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking. An hour later, I found something strange. The trail, which had been clear and steady, suddenly split into two. That didn't make sense. The map I had showed only one trail, a single line stretching through the forest. But here it was, an unmistakable fork. One path looked like the one I had been following, narrow, winding, cutting through the trees. The other was different. It was wider, smoother, as if it had been cleared recently. But there were no signs of human activity. No footprints, no tire tracks. Just a clean, almost unnatural-looking path leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated. I should have turned back right then. But I didn't. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took the new path. First, it felt normal, easier even. The ground was level, the trees evenly spaced. I moved faster, thinking maybe this was an old maintenance trail. But then I saw something that made me stop cold. A single boot, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't old. The leather was worn but intact, the laces still looped through the eyelets. Someone had lost it recently, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here. I bent down to look closer, and that's when I saw it. The boot had been cut. Not torn, not weathered, cut cleanly, straight down the middle, like something sharp had sliced right through it. My stomach tightened. I straightened up and looked around. The trees seemed taller now, their trunks stretching impossibly high. The silence was suffocating. I turned back the way I came. The path was gone. I spun in a circle. The wide, smooth trail I had been following had disappeared. In its place was untouched forest. No sign of a path, no break in the trees. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Panic surged in my chest. I knew better than to run. I took a deep breath, forced myself to think. I still had my compass, my map. If I could just get my bearings. Then I saw something move, a shape deep in the trees, just a flicker of movement too fast to make out. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. I reached into my pack, gripping my knife. My heart was pounding, but I had to stay focused. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started walking, not running, not panicking, just moving. I needed to find the original trail. I kept my steps quiet, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Then ahead of me, I saw it, clearing, a small, open space in the trees. Relief flooded through me. If I could get to the clearing, I could reorient myself, find my way back. I stepped forward and nearly fell. The ground beneath me sloped suddenly downward. Not a hill, not a dip, but a sharp, unnatural drop. I barely caught myself before tumbling in. It wasn't a pit. It was something else. A long, deep trench stretching into the trees. And at the bottom, I swallowed hard. Bones. Not animal bones. Not random, scattered remains. These were human. Skulls, ribs, femurs all piled together. Some were old, yellowed with age. Others, some were fresh. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my body felt frozen. Then, behind me, a twig snapped. I turned. A figure stood just beyond the trees. Tall, still, watching. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't care about the noise, about keeping calm. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the trees, my pack slamming against my back. Branches tore at my skin. My lungs burned. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then, a break in the trees. A real one this time. I burst into the open and saw it, my car. I didn't question how. I just ran. I threw open the door, shoved the keys into the ignition, and peeled out onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never found that trail again. I tried looking for it, but it was gone, like it had never existed. The map? Useless. The place wasn't on any record. I still don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know, but I know one thing for sure. Some places aren't meant to be found. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and disconnect from the world for a few days. The route I chose was deep in the wilderness, miles away from any towns or cell service. It was supposed to be challenging but rewarding, with stunning views and untouched nature. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and set off. The first day was everything I had hoped for. Pure solitude, fresh air, and the sound of nothing but my boots crunching on the dirt. The trail was well marked, and I made good time. By sunset, I had set up camp near a small stream, cooked a simple meal, and sat by my fire, feeling satisfied. The second day was harder. The elevation gain was brutal, and the trail became rougher, less maintained. Thick tree roots jutted out of the ground, forcing me to watch my step. The silence felt heavier. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone, miles from civilization. Of course, it would feel eerie. By late afternoon, I reached an old, abandoned fire lookout tower. I had read about it in my research, a relic from the past, now just a decaying wooden structure with a rusted ladder leading up to the platform. I climbed up to take in the view. The endless stretch of forest, the jagged peaks in the distance, the fading sun casting long shadows. It was beautiful, but something about it also felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling and set up camp nearby. As I prepared for the night, I heard something, a low, distant sound, almost like a groan. I froze. It wasn't an animal noise. It wasn't the wind. It sounded human, but far away, carried through the trees. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Nothing. Just silence again. I tried to tell myself it was the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the structure of the lookout shifting in the breeze. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not heavy, but not light enough to be an animal. Every time I unzipped my tent to check, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but trees and darkness. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I packed up and got moving as quickly as possible. I felt better once I was back on the trail, but something gnawed at me, a feeling like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. The trail became rougher, barely a path at all. Bushes clawed at my legs, and fallen trees forced me to climb or go around. I checked my map and GPS frequently. This section of the trail was supposed to lead to an old service road, which would take me back to the main route. But I never found it. Instead, I found something else. At first, I thought it was just another abandoned campsite. But as I got closer, I realized how wrong I was. The tent was shredded, not collapsed, ripped apart. Gear was scattered, torn clothing half buried under leaves. A backpack lay open, its contents spilling out, but no food. No sign of an animal raid, just destruction. And no people. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever had been here had left, or something had made them leave. I looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, searching for any sign of where they went. Nothing. That's when I noticed the marks. Deep scratches in the trees. Not claw marks, something else. Something deliberate. I didn't want to be here anymore. I checked my GPS again. Still no sign of the service road. I was running low on water, and the sun was already dipping lower. I needed to find my way back to the main trail. I walked faster. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not mine. Somewhere behind me, steady, matching my pace. I turned so fast I nearly lost my footing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing down on me. I moved faster, almost jogging. The trees blurred past me. I wasn't thinking about exhaustion or the weight of my pack anymore. I just wanted to get out. Then I saw it. A second campsite, just like the first. Same destruction, same eerie silence. But this one was worse. There were no signs of people, just more shredded tents, broken gear, a fire pit, long cold. And the worst part, a notebook half buried in the dirt. I picked it up with shaking hands. The pages were smeared with dirt and rain, but I could still read some of the words. Scattered entries, not dated, but frantic. Something is out here. I keep hearing it. No way out. The last page just had one sentence scrawled in thick, desperate letters. It knows I see it. I dropped the notebook and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I ran in the direction I thought was back toward my car, crashing through the trees, branches cutting my arms. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Even when I swore I heard something running behind me. Took hours, maybe longer, but eventually I saw it. The dirt road where my car was parked. I stumbled onto it, gasping, drenched in sweat. My car was untouched, just sitting there like nothing had happened. I fumbled with my keys, got inside, and locked the doors. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. Then, just before I started the engine, I looked up, back toward the trailhead. And I swear, in the fading light, I saw movement, a shape just at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't wait to see more. I started the car, slammed it into drive, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported what I saw. What would I even say? I just know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and whoever or whatever was watching me knew I saw it too. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was cool, and the sky was a pale blue, with streaks of orange cutting through the horizon. I had planned this trip for weeks, mapping out the trail, checking the weather, and making sure I had enough supplies. It wasn't a long hike, just a 2-day trip through a remote section of forest, but I wanted to be prepared. The area was known for its rough terrain and unpredictable weather. The trail started off easy. The first few miles were mostly flat, winding through tall pine trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the distant rustling of leaves made the forest feel alive. I had a heavy pack on my back, filled with food, water, and a small tent. My boots crunched against the dirt path, and every step felt solid and reassuring. As I went deeper into the woods, the trail became narrower. The trees grew closer together, and the air smelled thick with pine and damp earth. I checked my map often, making sure I was on the right path. The plan was to reach a small clearing by late afternoon, set up camp, and continue the next morning. I had studied satellite images of the area, but nothing compared to being out here, surrounded by nature. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a fallen log, sat down, and pulled out a sandwich from my pack. As I chewed, I listened to the sounds around me. The forest was never truly quiet. Leaves rustled, birds flapped their wings, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint trickle of running water. That was a good sign. I knew there was a small stream nearby, and I had planned to refill my bottles there. After a short break, I kept moving. The terrain started changing. The ground became uneven, covered in exposed roots and loose rocks. I had to watch my step carefully. One wrong move and I could twist an ankle or worse. The deeper I went, the less maintained the trail became. It was clear that not many people came this way. Some parts of the path were overgrown with ferns, and fallen branches forced me to step off the trail briefly. The sun was starting to lower in the sky when I reached the clearing I had planned to camp at. It was a small, open space with a few scattered trees and a large, flat rock in the center. Perfect spot. I dropped my pack, stretched my arms, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresher here, and the temperature had dropped slightly. I wasted no time setting up my tent, using the last of the daylight to secure it properly. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry branches and started a small fire. As I sat by the fire, I ate another meal and stared into the flames. The woods around me were dark now. The only light came from the fire and the faint glow of the moon above. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a soft whisper that never really stopped. There were no other signs of life, no distant voices, no other campers. I was alone. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude. But there was something about being deep in the woods at night that made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just a feeling, like the forest was watching. I tried to shake the thought and focused on the fire. After a while, my body started to feel heavy, the exhaustion of the day settling in. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, double-checked that my tent was zipped up, and crawled inside my sleeping bag. The night was cold. Even inside my tent, I could feel the temperature drop. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and listened to the sounds outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees more violently. A few times I thought I heard something moving nearby, probably just an animal, maybe a deer. I told myself that over and over until, eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat on my back despite the cold. I stayed still, listening. The wind was still there, rustling through the trees. But there was something else. A crunch. Not the sound of wind moving branches. Not the distant call of an animal. Something was stepping on the dry leaves outside my tent. Something heavy. I held my breath. Another step. Closer this time. I felt frozen. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. A bear? A mountain lion? But neither of those animals would move so cautiously. Predators either attack or they don't. This felt deliberate. The steps stopped. Silence. I waited, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting to see a shadow, hear another step. But nothing came. The forest was still except for the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, unmoving, listening to the darkness. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for hours. I unzipped my tent slowly and peeked outside. The forest looked the same, calm, peaceful. But when I stepped out, I noticed something. Footprints, not animal prints, human. They circled my tent, stopping just a few feet away. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. Someone had been out here with me. Someone had been watching me sleep. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just moved. Every now and then, I checked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But there was no one. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. I never saw anything, never heard another step. But I felt it, that weight on my back, that pressure in my gut telling me I wasn't alone. I reached my car by the afternoon, threw my pack inside, and got in. When I locked the doors, I finally let out a long breath. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I told myself I had imagined it, that the footprints could have been old, that the sounds could have been an animal. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had been out there with me, and they had waited until I fell asleep. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. The goal was simple. 3 days, deep in the wilderness, no distractions. I chose a lesser-known trail in the Pacific Northwest, one I had read about on an old hiking forum. Not many people talked about it, and that was exactly what I wanted: solitude, nature, and the challenge of navigating a path that wasn't crowded with tourists. The drive out there took most of the morning. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road, the kind that made me grateful for my truck suspension. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was close to noon. My pack was heavy, but I had everything I needed: food, a water filter, extra clothes, a tent, a small first aid kit, and a knife strapped to my hip. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I also wasn't stupid. The first few miles were perfect. The path wound through dense pine forests, the air crisp and fresh. Sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams, and the only sounds were my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. It felt exactly like I had hoped: isolated, peaceful. After about 5 miles, the trail started getting rougher. The path narrowed, overgrown with roots and brambles, and I had to push through in places where nature was reclaiming the route. I checked my map frequently to stay on track. This wasn't a maintained trail, just an old route from logging days, barely marked. It wasn't even on official maps anymore, just a faint line on an outdated topographic one I had found online. By late afternoon, I set up camp near a small creek. The water was clear, cold, and perfect for filtering. I ate a simple dinner, watched the sun dip behind the trees, and enjoyed the stillness. That first night, everything was normal. I slept light, as I always did outdoors, but nothing disturbed me beyond the usual rustling of small animals. The second day was when things started feeling off. The trail got even harder to follow. At times, it completely disappeared, forcing me to rely on my map, compass, and gut instincts. The forest grew denser, the trees taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There was a weight in the air, something subtle but noticeable, like the pressure before a storm. The silence became unnatural. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird call or insect hum for hours, just the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. Then, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. A few feet off the trail, there was something hanging from a low branch. At first, I thought it was trash, some old fabric caught in the wind. But as I got closer, I saw it was a bundle of sticks, bound together with twine, a small bone tied at the center. It looked deliberate, ritualistic. My gut told me to keep moving. I picked up the pace. My plan was to reach a small clearing I had marked on my map, camp there, and then head back the next morning. I told myself the bundle was just some weird thing left by another hiker, maybe a joke, maybe something else. Either way, I wasn't superstitious. I pushed forward. An hour later, I found the second one. This one was hanging right in the middle of the trail. The same structure: sticks, twine, a small bone. but this time it was bigger, more intricate, and beneath it, on the dirt, was a single deep footprint. Not mine. Larger, barefoot. It was fresh. I stopped, listened. The forest was utterly silent. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Someone was out here. Someone who didn't want to be found. I didn't run. Running in the wilderness is how you get lost or injured. Instead, I forced myself to walk steadily, heart hammering in my chest. I checked my knife, made sure it was secure. Every few minutes, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. I reached the clearing just as the sun dipped into the horizon. It was a wide, open space surrounded by thick pines. In the center, a massive, ancient tree stood alone, its bark weathered and twisted. It should have felt like a safe spot. Didn't. I set up my tent fast, every movement tight with tension. I built a fire larger than usual. The light helped, but my nerves didn't settle. I kept scanning the tree line, watching for movement. Every so often, I thought I saw something. A shift in the shadows, a flicker of motion, but it was never clear. I forced myself to eat, but my stomach was tight. I was being watched. I could feel it. That night, I barely slept. Sometime in the early hours, I woke to a noise. A low, rhythmic tapping. Not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate. I lay still, gripping my knife, every muscle frozen. The sound came from just outside my tent. Tap, tap, tap. Couldn't breathe. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. The trees stood still, but the feeling remained. Someone was there, just beyond the light's reach, watching. I didn't sleep again. I sat upright, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The second the sun was up, I packed my gear and started hiking back, fast. The way back felt different. The silence was heavier. The forest felt like it was closing in. The stick bundles, more of them now, hung from the trees at random intervals, some fresh, some old. I moved quickly, not caring about the trail anymore, just heading in the direction of my truck. Then the worst moment. As I pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth, I saw movement ahead. Person, barefoot, thin, standing just between the trees. I couldn't see their face, just their shape. They didn't move. I turned and ran. I don't remember the last few miles. My body moved on autopilot, crashing through the brush, branches slashing at my arms. When I finally saw my truck, I felt like I might collapse. I threw my pack into the bed, jumped inside, and locked the doors before I even caught my breath. I didn't look back as I sped down that dirt road. When I got home, I went straight to my computer. I searched everything, old legends, missing hikers, anything. But that trail, it didn't exist. At least not officially. No records, no maps, nothing. I haven't been hiking since. I had always loved hiking alone. Something about being away from the noise, deep in the wilderness where it was just me, the trees, and the wind was calming. I liked the control. Choosing my own pace, stopping when I wanted, going as far as I felt like. So when I took a week off work, I planned a solo trip into the mountains. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It was an old logging road that had been abandoned years ago, now overgrown and rough. I had read about it in a forum where people shared off-the-beaten-path hiking spots. It was perfect, no tourists, no crowded viewpoints, just pure isolation. I started early in the morning, the air still crisp and cool. The first few miles were easy, just a steady incline through thick trees. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and the only real sound was my boots crunching on dirt. It felt good to be out there. No emails, no phone calls, no stress. A few hours in, I noticed the path getting narrower, less maintained. It was clear that few people had come this way in a long time. Bushes encroached on the trail, fallen logs blocked parts of it, and at times I had to push my way through branches. I wasn't worried, though. I had a GPS, extra food, and I knew how to handle myself. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a rock with a view overlooking a deep valley. It was beautiful, miles of green stretching into the distance. Nothing but wilderness. I felt lucky to be there, away from everything. But as I sat there, I realized something. It was too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind, which had been a constant presence all morning, had died down completely. There was nothing but silence. At first, I told myself it was normal. Animals go quiet sometimes. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bear or a cougar. I scanned the trees, my hand resting on the knife I kept on my belt, but I saw nothing. Still, the silence was unsettling. It made me feel exposed, like I was being watched. I finished eating quickly and got moving again, telling myself I was just overthinking it. But the further I hiked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail, which had already been rough, was getting worse. Trees had fallen across it at odd angles, like something had forced them down. Some of them had deep scratches in the bark, long parallel lines, too clean to be natural. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I had planned to set up camp. It was a small, flat patch of land beside a creek, perfect for the night. But something was wrong. The ground was disturbed, fresh, deep marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged through. I crouched down, running my fingers over the impressions. They weren't tire tracks. They were too uneven, too irregular. And they were recent. The dirt was still loose. A part of me wanted to turn back, but I had hiked too far. It would be dark soon, and hiking back at night wasn't an option. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and tried to ignore the unease gnawing at me. The night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, dragging sound. Something heavy. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see shadows moving beyond the thin fabric of my tent. Then it stopped. For what felt like forever, there was silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it, I heard a low, shuffling noise right outside my tent. I grabbed my knife, forcing myself to stay still. My heart was pounding. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I also didn't. I just sat there, knife in hand, listening. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The sounds faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking back. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. I had marked trees as I hiked up, small scratches with my knife to help me find my way back. But they were gone. Every single one. I tried to stay calm. I had a GPS. I followed it, but the further I went, the more the landscape didn't match what I remembered. Trees I didn't recognize, turns I didn't take on the way up. Then I found the first footprint. Not mine. Bigger, deeper. Someone or something had been following me. Panic started creeping in. I moved faster, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods felt wrong. The trees pressing in, the silence unbearable. Hours passed, but I wasn't making progress. My GPS was useless, pointing me in directions that didn't make sense. My water was running low. The sun was getting lower. Then I saw it. A shape in the trees. Not an animal. Not a person. Just a shadow, too still, too tall. Watching. I didn't think. I ran. Branches whipped my face. My legs burned, but I kept going. I ran until my lungs felt like they would explode, until my legs threatened to give out. And then, somehow, I was back on a real trail. A wide one with clear markings, one I knew led back to the main road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I saw my car, until I was inside with the doors locked. I never reported it. What would I say? That something in the woods was watching me? That the trail changed? That I found footprints that weren't mine? No one would believe me, but I know what I felt, and I know I'll never go back there. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some places don't want you there, and I listened. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I enjoyed, just me, the trees, and the open trail. No distractions, no noise, just nature. This time, I had planned a solo trip deep in the Montana wilderness. A 3-day trek, miles away from any town. The trail wasn't well known, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The path wound through dense trees, with the occasional clearing that revealed rolling hills stretching into the distance. I followed my map, marking my progress. My pack was heavy with supplies: water, food, a tent, a knife, and a first aid kit. Everything I needed. By evening, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing beside a shallow stream. I pitched my tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The silence out here was comforting. No distant hum of cars, no voices. Just the occasional rustling in the bushes, likely rabbits or deer. As darkness settled, I climbed into my tent and zipped myself in. The night was quiet, except for the occasional chirping of crickets. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike. The second day started normal. I packed up my gear and continued down the trail. The forest thickened, the air cooler under the shade. Around midday, I came across something strange. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly in the middle of the path. At first, I thought it was just some hiker's way of marking the trail, but as I looked closer, I noticed that each rock was different in size and shape, carefully balanced. Something about it felt off. I took a photo, then carefully stepped around it and kept walking. After another hour, I saw another pile. This time, the rocks were stacked higher. I felt uneasy. Someone had placed these here, and I hadn't seen a single person since I started this hike. As the afternoon stretched on, I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. The trees felt taller, the spaces between them darker. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen. Nothing, just the wind. But my gut told me I wasn't alone. I hiked faster, putting more distance between myself and those strange rock piles. When the sun started setting, I found a spot to camp. I forced myself to eat, though my appetite was gone. The uneasiness clung to me like damp air. I built a fire, bigger than the night before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not animals, not the wind, just movement, subtle, shuffling, crunching. Every time I unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight, there was nothing. By dawn, I was exhausted. I wanted to keep going, finish my hike. But as I packed up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another pile of rocks, right next to my tent. This one was smaller, but it hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been near me while I slept. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to enjoy the morning air. I just packed and started walking. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. I found more stacks of rocks, each one larger than the last. They weren't just on the path anymore. They were beside trees, near boulders, even balanced on fallen logs. Someone was doing this, and they wanted me to know they were there. Around midday, I reached a section of the trail that had a steep drop on one side. I moved carefully, my boots kicking small rocks over the edge. The sound of them bouncing down was swallowed by the trees below. That's when I saw it. A figure, far down the path, standing completely still. I stopped, my body frozen. It wasn't close enough for me to see details, but I knew it was a person. They were just standing there, blocking the trail. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My heart was hammering. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, but I had no other way. I had to go forward. I took a step. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. I kept walking, slowly, my hands tightening around the straps of my pack. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't looking at me. It was turned slightly away, head tilted down. They were wearing old, tattered clothes, dirty and torn. Bare feet, darkened with grime. Their hands were hanging limp at their sides. I took another step, then another. I was close now, maybe 30 feet away. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I didn't want to speak. I didn't want them to turn. Then, in one quick motion, they moved. They didn't turn toward me. Instead, they stepped off the trail, just walked straight into the trees. vanishing into the thick brush like they had never been there. I stood there, my whole body rigid, my ears strained, listening. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. I ran. I ran so fast my pack bounced violently against my back. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The trail blurred past me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I didn't think. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees. The end of the trail. My car. I nearly collapsed as I reached it. My hands fumbled for my keys, shaking so hard I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked every door, and sat there, gasping for air. I don't know who that was. I don't know why they were out there, but I do know one thing. When I glanced in my rearview mirror before driving off, there was a pile of rocks, right behind my car. I should have turned back when I had the chance. I had been planning this hike for months. The idea was simple. Drive out to a remote trail deep in the mountains, spend the weekend alone, clear my mind, and get away from everything. I wasn't new to hiking. I had done plenty of solo trips before, but this one was different. The trail I chose was not popular. I found it buried in an old forum post, mentioned by someone who had hiked it years ago. There were no recent reviews, no maps other than a vague, outdated topographical one, and only a handful of references online. That should have been my first warning. The drive itself took longer than expected. I followed an old, cracked road that wound up into the mountains. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, with deep drop-offs on one side and a dense forest pressing in on the other. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. There was no sign, no designated parking area, just a small clearing off the road. I pulled in, cut the engine, and stepped out. The air was cool and still. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, double-checked my gear, and started down the trail. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow, cutting through thick undergrowth. It was overgrown in some spots, as if no one had been through in years. I had to push aside branches and duck under fallen trees. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs, the sound loud in the otherwise silent forest. I hadn't seen a single sign of human activity, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It was around dusk when I reached the spot where I had planned to camp. It was a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. The heat was comforting, pushing back the creeping cold of the evening. I ate, stretched out beside the fire, and watched the stars appear overhead. Then I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, somewhere in the distance. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Still, I kept my headlamp on a little longer than usual before crawling into my tent. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire had burned down to embers. The air was freezing, and then I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind my tent. I held my breath. My first thought was a bear. I reached for my knife, keeping still, but something felt off. The steps weren't heavy enough for a bear. And they weren't the erratic movements of an animal. They were steady, slow, like someone walking carefully. I listened for what felt like forever, my heart hammering. Then silence. After a long time, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling. Maybe my imagination. I forced myself to lie back down, though it took a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, stretching. My breath hung in the cold air. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I checked around my campsite, looking for tracks. Nothing. But as I was packing up, I noticed something odd. A single boot print just at the edge of my camp. It wasn't mine. The print was older, partially covered by fallen leaves, but it was definitely there. And it wasn't an animal's. It looked like a hiking boot, maybe a size bigger than mine. I stared at it for a long time. It had been years since anyone had talked about this trail. Who else would be out here? I pushed the thought away and kept moving. The second day of hiking was tougher. The trail grew steeper, winding through rocky terrain. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged cliffs and uneven ground. My legs burned as I climbed, but I kept going. That afternoon, the feeling started. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. The unease grew stronger as the day wore on. The wind seemed quieter. The forest felt off, like something was watching me. By evening, I found another place to camp, an open plateau overlooking the valley below. The view was incredible, but I couldn't enjoy it. That sense of being watched was stronger now. I tried to ignore it as I set up my tent and started a fire. As darkness settled, I forced myself to eat. The silence was oppressive. Every small sound made my skin crawl. My brain kept playing tricks on me, making me think I saw movement at the edge of my vision. Then, as I was adding wood to the fire, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, far enough that I couldn't make out details. But it was there. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the firelight? A tree? But no, it was a person, standing perfectly still. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trees unmoving. I scanned back and forth, my hand shaking. Nothing. I told myself I was seeing things. The isolation was getting to me. I hadn't spoken to another person in 2 days. My mind was playing tricks, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I broke camp quickly. I wanted to get out. I wasn't enjoying this trip anymore. The trail back was supposed to be a loop, leading me back to my car by evening. I moved fast, pushing myself harder than usual. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. A campsite, abandoned, and not old. The tent was still there, collapsed. A fire pit with blackened wood. A backpack, half unzipped, spilling out clothes and supplies. A pair of boots, placed neatly beside the remnants of the tent. No sign of anyone. I called out, my voice breaking the eerie silence. Nothing. I checked the backpack. The food inside was expired but not rotten. There was no ID, no name, no indication of who it belonged to. But the thing that made my stomach drop was the notebook. It was lying near the tent, half covered in dirt. I picked it up and flipped through it, pages filled with frantic handwriting. Something is following me. I see it at night. It doesn't make noise. It knows I see it. The last entry was just 2 words, scrawled so hard into the paper that it nearly tore. Not alone. I dropped the notebook and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. The trail blurred past me. I don't remember much of the descent, only that the feeling of being watched never left me. I reached my car just as the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and tore down that narrow mountain road without looking back. I don't know who left that campsite. I don't know what happened to them, but I do know one thing. I was not alone out there. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me peace, a break from the noise of the world. This time, I planned a trip to a lesser-known trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't completely off-grid, but it wasn't popular either. A friend had mentioned it to me months ago, saying it was beautiful but tough. That was exactly what I wanted. The trail started off easy, a dirt path winding through thick trees, the sound of birds and rustling leaves filling the air. The air was crisp, the kind that feels fresh in your lungs. I had my backpack packed with everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a knife, a small tent, and a map of the area. My plan was to hike up to a clearing near the ridge, set up camp for the night, then head back the next day. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No distant chatter from other hikers, no signs of anyone else. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. It was perfect. A few hours in, the path got steeper, and the trees grew denser. Sunlight barely reached the ground, making everything dim even though it was still daytime. I checked my map and compass often, making sure I was on track. Everything seemed fine. Around midday, I stopped to eat. Sitting on a fallen log, I pulled out a sandwich and enjoyed the silence. That's when I noticed something strange. A little further up the trail, off to the side, there was a clearing, but it didn't look natural. The trees were cut in a way that looked too deliberate, like someone had made space for something. The ground was covered in dead grass, and there were small rocks arranged in a pattern. I walked closer, feeling an unease I couldn't explain. The rocks were placed in rows, some forming small piles. It didn't look like a fire pit or a camp setup. It looked purposeful, like a marker or a warning. I shook it off and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge where I planned to camp. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills stretching far into the distance, the sky turning shades of orange and red. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back, enjoying the evening. The quiet was peaceful, but it was also heavy. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. I listened. First, there was nothing, just the wind. But then, faintly, I heard it, a crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath. Could be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a fox. But the sound was steady, too slow, too careful. I stayed still, waiting. Then another sound, closer. This time, I knew it wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, human footsteps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My heart pounded as I lay there, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Silence. Then, a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The wind? No, it was too deliberate. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, the sound faded. I waited even longer before I dared to move. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, the forest still and dark. But something was off. My backpack was open. I knew I had zipped it. I always did. Nothing was missing, but someone had gone through it. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun started rising, I packed up and got moving. The way down felt different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt wrong. Then, about halfway down, I saw it. A shoe. Just one, lying in the dirt off the side of the trail. It was old, weathered, and next to it, barely visible under the leaves, was something worse. A ripped piece of fabric. I picked it up, stiff, torn at the edges, faded with time. I looked around. The trees felt taller, the silence heavier. I moved faster. By the time I reached the start of the trail, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I didn't stop until I got to my car, locked the doors, and sat there trying to calm my breathing. As I drove away, I thought about the shoe, the fabric, the strange clearing, and the footsteps outside my tent. Something had happened in those woods, and someone was still out there. I had been planning this solo hike for months, a 3-day trek through the backcountry, far from the tourist-heavy trails, deep in the wilderness. It was the kind of hike I loved most. Isolated, challenging, and rewarding. The drive to the trailhead was long and uneventful. I parked my car in a dirt lot, checked my gear, and set off. The trail was rough, barely maintained, just as I expected. Thick pine trees lined the path, their scent filling the crisp morning air. The first few miles were easy, just a steady incline through a dense forest. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After a few hours, I reached a clearing with a small stream. I stopped for a break, refilled my water, and checked my map. Everything was going as planned. My goal was to reach a secluded ridge before nightfall, where I'd set up camp. There were no official campsites, just a flat area I had marked from satellite images. It would be quiet, undisturbed, perfect. As I continued, the trail became less defined. It was clear not many people hiked this way. I had to navigate using my map and GPS. I didn't mind, it was part of the adventure. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. That was the appeal. Around late afternoon, I noticed something odd. A single old boot sitting in the middle of the trail. It was weathered, cracked, as if it had been there for years. I glanced around but saw nothing else. No backpack, no sign of anyone. Just the boot. It was strange, but I pushed it out of my mind. People lost things all the time. I hiked on, reaching the ridge as the sun dipped low. The view was incredible. Rolling hills stretching for miles, untouched wilderness in every direction. I set up my tent, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue. It was perfect. That night I barely slept. Not from fear, just the usual unease of being alone in the wild. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, made my mind race. But I reminded myself, I'm the only person out here. There's nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I packed up and continued. My plan was to loop around and return by a different route. As I walked, I noticed a faint path branching off from my trail. It wasn't on my map, probably an old game trail. I felt curious, so I followed it for a bit. A mile in, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A campsite, but not a normal one. It was abandoned, scattered with torn gear, broken poles, and shredded fabric. A backpack lay half buried in the dirt, its contents spilling out. Clothes, a cooking pot, a knife. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no notes. Just this wreckage, as if someone had left in a hurry. Or worse, I felt uneasy. I scanned the area, listening. Nothing. It was dead silent. I considered turning back, but curiosity kept me there. I searched the ground, looking for clues. The gear was old, but not ancient, maybe a year, maybe less. It hadn't been taken by animals. Something else had happened here. Then I found the rope. A length of thick rope tied around a low-hanging tree branch. A noose. It swayed gently in the breeze. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite. Something terrible had happened here. I left, quickly. Back on my original path, I forced myself to stay calm. People did strange things in the wild. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had been in distress, left in a hurry. But the noose, that was deliberate. That was something else. I hiked faster than before, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being alone, which I had once enjoyed, now felt suffocating. Then I heard it. A snap. Not a normal branch breaking. It was sharp, deliberate. I froze, listening. Silence. I waited, heart pounding. Then another snap. Closer. I wasn't alone. I didn't see anything, but I knew. Someone was there, watching. I moved fast, nearly running. My goal now was simple: get out of this place. The peaceful hike I had planned was over. Now it was survival. As I pushed forward, the trail became harder to follow. I knew I was going the right way, but something felt off. I should have reached a certain marker by now, a large boulder I had noted on the map. But it wasn't there. I checked my GPS, dead. My phone? Also dead. Panic crept in. I had full battery that morning. There was no reason for them both to die. The sound came again. Closer. This time, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran. Branches whipped my face. Roots caught my feet. But I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. Then I saw it, the boulder. Finally, I was on the right path. Relief surged through me. I didn't stop moving until I reached the main trail, the one closer to civilization. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I never saw who it was. I never looked back. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my pack inside and drove without stopping, not even bothering to change out of my dirty clothes. When I got home, I checked the maps again. That path I had followed, it wasn't on any official records. That campsite, no reports, no missing persons that matched the gear I saw. It was like it had never existed. I haven't gone on a solo hike since. I always liked hiking alone. It was peaceful, a break from the noise of the city. No music, no traffic, just the sound of my boots crunching the dirt and the wind whispering through the trees. It was my way of resetting my mind, clearing out all the stress that built up during the week. I had been doing it for years, and I thought I knew what I was doing. But this hike was different. I had planned everything the way I always did. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, a remote one in the mountains. It wasn't too long, about 10 miles round trip, but it was steep. The reviews online said it was tough but rewarding, with some of the best views in the region. I packed my gear. Plenty of water, some snacks, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a headlamp. I even brought a small emergency bivy sack just in case. My phone was fully charged, but I knew I wouldn't have service. I didn't worry about that too much. I had hiked plenty of times without service. I got to the trailhead around 7 in the morning. My car was the only one in the parking lot. That should have been my first warning sign. Even on lesser-known trails, there's usually at least one other car. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just early. Maybe people didn't like hiking this trail because it was too hard. That thought actually made me feel good. I liked the idea of having the place to myself. The first few miles were fine. The incline was brutal, but I had expected that. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush, probably squirrels or deer. Felt like a normal hike. Then I noticed something weird. I was about 3 miles in when I saw the first one. A tree, stripped of its bark about 6 feet up, deep scratch marks running down its trunk. I stopped and stared at it. I had seen claw marks on trees before. Bears do it all the time, but these looked different. They weren't spaced right for a bear. They were too long, too deep. I ran my fingers over them. The edges were fresh. Whatever made them had done it recently. I felt uneasy but kept going. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe some animal had a strange way of marking territory. Still, I picked up my pace a little. About a mile later, I saw something else. A deer, or what was left of one. It was off the trail, just past a small clearing. I could smell it before I saw it. The body was torn open, its insides spread out like something had been eating it. But the strange part was the way it was positioned. Its legs were bent at odd angles, like they had been broken before it died. There was no sign of struggle, no drag marks, no disturbed leaves. It was just there, like it had been placed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't normal. I turned back to the trail and kept moving. I wasn't gonna run. Running makes you look like prey, but I didn't stop to take in the scenery anymore. I just wanted to reach the summit, take a quick look, and head back down. That's when I realized something else. The forest was silent. I stopped walking and listened. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. My stomach twisted into a knot. I had been in the woods enough to know that when everything goes quiet, it means there's a predator nearby. I gripped my knife and forced myself to keep going. After what felt like forever, I made it to the summit. The view was incredible, miles of rolling mountains stretching out in every direction. But I barely looked at it. I just wanted to turn around and get out of there. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. Not hiking boots. Bare feet. And they weren't old. The dirt was still loose around the edges, like they had been made minutes ago. I felt something watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I started walking back down, fast but not running. My body was screaming at me to run, but I knew better. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to think I was weak. I gripped my knife tighter. The hike back felt different. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. The silence pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Every few minutes, I would glance over my shoulder, sure I would see something, but there was nothing. Then I saw the second deer. It was just like the first one. Torn open, legs broken, no signs of struggle. But this one was fresh. The blood was still wet, and it was right next to the trail. I forced myself to keep walking. My hands were shaking. I was sweating even though the air was cool. I just needed to get to my car. I wasn't even thinking about what I had seen anymore. I just needed to leave. Then, finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. My car was still there. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I stepped out of the tree line, walked straight to my car, and got inside, locking the doors. That's when I saw the footprints again, right next to my car. Bare feet, leading up to the driver's side door. My stomach turned to ice. Someone had been here. Someone had been waiting. I turned the key so fast I nearly broke it. The engine roared to life and I threw it into reverse. Gravel sprayed as I backed out. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding. My mind was racing. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again. I had been planning the hike for weeks, a solo trip through the mountains, away from the noise of the city, away from people. Just me, the forest, and the trail. I picked a route that was remote but not completely isolated, one of those lesser-known trails that had some online reviews but weren't exactly tourist hotspots. I wanted solitude, not danger. I left early in the morning, the sun just beginning to light up the sky as I parked my truck at the trailhead. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I checked my gear, extra food, plenty of water, a first aid kit, a knife, and a map with a compass. I had my phone, but I knew better than to rely on it. Signal would be spotty at best, non-existent at worst. I had told my brother my route and estimated return time. Safety first. The first few miles were easy. Well-worn paths, gradual inclines, the kind of hike that makes you feel alive without making you struggle. Birds chirped in the trees, and I even spotted a few deer in the distance. It was perfect. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued west, but a narrower, less trodden path veered north. I had read about this path in an old forum post. Someone had mentioned that it led to a hidden valley with stunning views, but also that it was easy to get lost if you weren't careful. I had my compass, my map, and daylight on my side. I decided to go for it. The trail was rougher than I expected. Overgrown in places, roots sticking out, rocks loose underfoot. It was clear that not many people took this path. I moved carefully, checking my position on the map every so often. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded. It wasn't silent, but it felt off, like something was just out of place. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a single marker or footprint. The trail was supposed to loop back towards the main path eventually, but I wasn't seeing any sign of that happening. I pulled out my map again, but the landmarks around me didn't match what I expected. That gnawing feeling of unease started to creep in. I decided to backtrack. If I followed my own footprints, I'd get back to the main trail. Simple enough. But as I turned, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There were no footprints. The soft dirt should have held my tracks, but the path behind me looked untouched. I knew I had come this way. I had stepped through mud not 10 minutes ago. There should have been some sign of me passing, but there was nothing. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe the ground had dried faster than I thought. Maybe the wind had scattered the prints. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping an eye on the trees, looking for anything familiar. But nothing was familiar anymore. The trees looked the same in every direction. The path twisted in ways I didn't remember. I wasn't just lost, I was completely turned around. My compass still pointed north, but it was like the trail itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. I walked for another hour, maybe two, hoping to find something, anything, that I recognized. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I had to make a decision. I could keep moving and risk getting even more lost in the dark, or I could set up camp and wait until morning when I'd have better visibility. My gut told me to stop, so I did. I found a relatively flat area near a fallen tree and set up my small tent. I built a fire, ate one of my protein bars, and tried to focus on a plan. If I followed the sun's direction in the morning, I should be able to head west and intersect with the main trail. I just had to make it through the night. The forest was unnervingly quiet as darkness settled in. I had camped alone before, but this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was just beyond the firelight, watching. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance, a rhythmic, deliberate noise, footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The footsteps were slow, steady, not an animal too heavy, not another hiker too deliberate. I reached for my knife and held it tight. Then they stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, staring into the dark. Nothing moved. The fire flickered, casting shadows against the trees. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the wind, but I knew better. Something or someone was out there. I barely slept. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time packing up. I needed to get out of there. I moved fast, ignoring my exhaustion, pushing forward. But no matter which way I went, nothing looked right. I started marking trees with my knife, making sure I wasn't going in circles. Hours passed. My water supply was running low. My legs ached. Then I saw something ahead. A structure. Not a cabin. Not a ranger station. Just a shack. Old, rotting, barely standing. Shouldn't have been there. No maps mentioned a structure out here. But at that moment, it was the only sign of anything human. I approached cautiously. The door hung open slightly. The inside was dark. It smelled like damp wood and decay. I stepped in. Inside, the walls were covered in deep scratches. Some looked old, others fresh. The floor was littered with broken glass, bones, small ones like from rabbits or birds. A backpack sat in the corner, torn open, its contents scattered. I checked the tag. It wasn't mine. Then I noticed the writing. Faint, scrawled into the wood near the door. Leave before night. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, not caring about direction anymore. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned. I ran until I stumbled onto something familiar, the main trail. I don't know how I found it, and I don't care. I followed it without stopping, pushing forward until I reached the parking lot. My truck was there, just as I had left it. I threw my gear inside and drove away without looking back. I never found out who wrote that message, or what made those scratches. But I know one thing, I was not alone in those woods, and whatever else was out there, it wanted me to stay. The wind carried the scent of pine through the air as I adjusted the straps on my backpack. It was early morning, the kind where the sun barely kisses the tops of the trees, stretching long shadows over the dirt path. My plan was simple: hike up to the ridge, camp for the night, and head back down the next day. A solo trip to clear my mind. I had picked this trail because it was remote, not completely uncharted, but far enough from popular routes that I didn't expect to see anyone else. That was part of the appeal. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The first few miles were easy, a gentle incline through thick woods. I kept a steady pace, listening to the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush. The trees stood tall, packed tightly together, their trunks rough with age. Some had deep grooves from where bears or other animals had scratched at the bark. I had seen plenty of signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, droppings off the path, but nothing out of the ordinary. The first sign that something felt wrong came around midday. The forest had been alive with birdsong earlier, but now it was silent. Not a single chirp. I stopped, listening, trying to figure out what had changed. My skin prickled. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally quiet. I shook it off and kept moving. Maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals were staying hidden. That made sense. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing between the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty trail winding behind me. A few miles later, I found a good clearing to set up camp. It was a flat area near a small stream, perfect for an overnight stay. I dropped my pack and stretched my arms, rolling the stiffness out of my shoulders. As I worked, that feeling of being watched never went away. It clung to me, heavy and suffocating. I set up my tent quickly, trying to focus on something tangible. The sun was setting by the time I had everything ready. I built a small fire and sat close to it, eating a simple meal. My body was tired, but my mind was alert, ears tuned to every noise in the dark. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows across the trees. I told myself that I was just on edge from hiking alone. That's all it was. Then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze. My breath hitched. It was close. I slowly turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, but I knew what I heard. I wasn't alone out here. I stood up, my body tense. Probably an animal, I muttered to myself, barely a whisper, but I didn't believe it. The sound was deliberate, careful. I reached into my bag and pulled out my flashlight. A beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the trees in front of me. Nothing. I swung it to the left, then the right. Still nothing. But just as I lowered it, I caught something in my peripheral vision movement. A flicker of motion behind the trees. I snapped the light back up, but whatever it was had vanished. My heart pounded. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. If someone or something was watching me, they had been careful to stay hidden. I didn't like that. I made the decision then. I wasn't going to stay the night. It wasn't worth it. My gut screamed at me to get out of there. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to make sure everything was secured. My hands were shaking as I stamped out the fire, plunging the campsite into near total darkness. I flicked my flashlight back on and started moving. Fast. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep going. Every few steps, I glanced back, expecting to see something following me. The trees felt closer, the air colder. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Then up ahead, I saw it. A shape standing in the middle of the trail. Not an animal, not some shadow trick of the trees. Person. I stopped dead in my tracks. The flashlight beam wavered in my grip as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. They weren't moving, just standing there completely still. I took a step back, my entire body screaming at me to run. But before I could react, the figure took a slow step forward. Then another. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches whipped against my face. Roots snagged at my boots. But I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually, I saw something ahead. My car. I had made it back to the trailhead. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't slow down. I fumbled with my keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine, headlights cutting through the dark. I expected to see the figure at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing, just an empty trail leading into the woods. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tearing down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never hike alone again. I had planned the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. 3 days alone in the mountains, a break from the world, no distractions, no people, just me and nature. I wanted to test myself, get away from my phone, clear my mind. I had done a few solo hikes before, but nothing like this. This was deeper, more remote. The kind of place where if something went wrong, no one was coming to help. That was part of the appeal. The trail I picked wasn't anything extreme, but it was out there. It was an old logging road that turned into a narrow path through thick forest, leading up to a ridge that overlooked a deep valley. The place was rarely visited. It was marked on maps, but you wouldn't find much about it online. No Instagram spots, no trip reports, just a name and a line on a topographic map. I started early. The first few miles were easy, worn dirt, scattered rocks, the occasional fallen tree. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of the forest were there. Birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. It was peaceful, but after a few hours, something started to feel off. It wasn't something obvious. It was just a feeling at first, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was in my head, that I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. But I couldn't shake it. The deeper I went, the stronger it got. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. Nothing, just my own breathing. By midday, I reached the base of the ridge. That's when I noticed the first strange thing, the silence. The wind had stopped. The birds had stopped. Even the trees, which had been swaying gently all morning, were still. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the elevation, the way the trees blocked the wind. But I couldn't ignore the unease crawling up my spine. I pressed on. The climb was rough, steep in places, but manageable. I took my time, keeping my eyes on the ground, focusing on each step. When I finally reached the top, I felt a small sense of relief. The view was incredible. A sea of green stretching out for miles, broken only by the occasional peak. I took off my pack, sat down, drank some water. For the first time in hours, I started to relax. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the ridge, maybe 200 feet away, was a clearing. In the middle of it stood a cabin. I hadn't seen it on the map. It looked old, weathered, like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged, the walls were dark with rot, the windows empty. But there was something else, something that made my stomach tighten. The door was open, just a few inches, like someone had left in a hurry. I told myself I wasn't going to check it out. I wasn't stupid, but as I sat there, staring at it, I couldn't look away. There were no roads leading to it, no trails. Shouldn't have been there. I got up. Slowly, I made my way across the clearing. Every step felt wrong, like I was crossing some invisible line I wasn't supposed to. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The wood was splintered, warped. It groaned under my weight as I stepped forward. Inside, it was worse. The air was thick, stale. The floor was covered in dirt, leaves, animal droppings. But it wasn't just old. It looked like someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dust, some fresher than others. A broken lantern sat on a table, next to a stack of papers, their edges curled and yellowed with age. A rusty stove stood in the corner, its door hanging open. Then I saw the bed. It was the only piece of furniture that looked untouched. The blankets were pulled up neatly, the pillow fluffed. But the worst part was the smell. It wasn't rot, or mildew, or anything you'd expect in an abandoned place. It was something else. Something sour, metallic. Blood. It was faint, but it was there. My stomach turned. I stepped back, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I turned, I noticed something else. The footprints. They weren't mine. They led from the door to the bed. And then they stopped. No other tracks. No sign of someone leaving. Just a single trail leading in. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran. Out of the cabin, across the clearing, back to the ridge. My legs were shaking as I grabbed my pack. I didn't care about resting anymore. I just wanted to get down, get away. The hike back was a blur. The feeling of being watched was worse now, stronger. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every sound made me flinch. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just kept going. I reached my car just as the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anything was there. I never found out who had been in that cabin. I never looked it up, never tried to find it again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footprints, about the bed, about the way the door had been left just barely open, like someone was waiting for me to come inside.